Chapter 14. Brando. Roman poked his arm, and Sophie was immersed in checking his own attributes. His strength was only 1 ounce. He could not help but curse the NPC for having no human rights. Even a skeleton had one. 5 ounces of strength. All the numerical units on the attributes were OZ, which was the abbreviation of the ancient word Ooth. The strength of 1 ounce meant that one could lift around 50 kilograms, and the strength of a punch would not exceed 150 kilograms, which was about the strength of an adult man. In the game, the basic attributes of the players were 2 ounces of strength, 2 ounces of agility, 2 ounces of vitality, 5 ounces of intelligence, willpower, and perceptive sense, which meant that they were about twice as strong as a normal person. Absolute strength, which was the so-called combat power, was about 5, which meant that it would not be a problem to deal with 5 normal people at the same time. Brando was a militia that had undergone months of training, and the difference in attributes was still so huge. Although the players started with heroic attributes, it should not be so ridiculous, right? He had always wanted to complain that the players started with heroic attributes, but in the end, their combat power was about the same as 2 skeletons. Who would have thought that from Brando's point of view, he would realize that the players in the past were really heroic with the protagonist's aura. When he thought that he might not even be able to defeat a skeleton, he could not help but feel sad. Sophie touched his arm, and the light green number playfully appeared in his vision. He realized that there were some differences between this world and the world he knew. In the game, the bandage should recover 1 HP per minute. Normally, a commoner's 6 HP would only take 6 minutes to recover, but it would take a few days in this world. This was not a good sign. Fortunately, the usage of skills were basically the same, and as long as he recalled the basic knowledge he obtained from his identity as a civilian, he would be able to recall some common knowledge about this world. Recalling the military organization he obtained from his identity as a militia, he would be able to recall Erwin's general knowledge about military organization. Although there were some differences, the knowledge seemed to exist directly in his real memory. Like swordsmanship, he could clearly feel that it was a skill that gathered bit by bit in his every move after months of training. For example, the posture when attacking, where the center of gravity should be placed, what to pay attention to under your feet, where your sword is, where the enemy's sword is, feints, and what the intention of the attack is. However, in the game, the system would only give you a few rough sword paths before you attacked. Then, it would help you adjust your attack during the attack. Here, you didn't need to know the why. You just needed to know the how. Although some veteran players would have their own insights, they would still have to rely on the system's assistance. Hence, you wouldn't see many gaming nerds becoming experts in swordsmanship or fighting in real life. There were some things that had no shortcuts. Sophie couldn't help but clench her fists. The feeling of being in control of herself was amazing. Compared to the stiffness in the game, the memories she controlled here were more like a part of her. She could use them as she wished. Of course, while he was thinking about this, he immediately turned around vigilantly when Roman poked him in the arm. His ears twitched slightly, and he could already hear the subtle sounds coming from outside the house. "Brando, did you hear that?" Romain went behind him and whispered. Sophie nodded. There was a row of footsteps outside, and there were quite a few of them. He was shocked and immediately guessed that the vanguard of Madara's army had arrived. He gestured for Romain to be quiet and immediately pulled Roman back. Madara's vanguard came faster than expected. At this moment, the countryside of Elsengran was still in a dream. No one would expect the coming disaster. Except for himself. Sophie could not help but frown because of the urgency of the situation. He brought Romain into the room at the end of the south side and gently closed the door. The room was filled with dust, and the two of them could not help but cough. This was a guest room that had not been used for a long time, but he knew that it was safe to monitor everything that was happening outside the manor from the window. Sophie walked to the window, gently swept away the dust, and lifted the curtain. Where did these things come from? Do you know where they came from? She asked curiously as she pulled her hand back without a trace. This is the army of Madara. The war has broken out. He carefully glanced outside as he answered. Sure enough, it was Madara's vanguard. Sophie could not help but take a light breath. In the middle of the manor stood a black mass of skeleton soldiers. He counted 3 small groups, a total of 45 skeletons. A dark red light jumped in the darkness. There were 3 liches controlling the low-level undead. They had the classic appearance of a skeleton wearing a long robe, holding a bone staff, and looking at the low-level Madara soldiers with flashing green phosphorescent eyes. Brando's grandfather's old house was located on a hillside not far from Butchie, overlooking the village. It was more like a small manor near the village. There used to be 5 or 6 families, but they all moved away, leaving only Roman and her aunt. The girl took a light breath in the darkness. Where's Aunt Jenny? She went to a nearby town and will be back for a week. Sophie could not help but look back at her. In the darkness, he could only see a pair of sparkling eyes, but they were flashing with an inexplicable excitement. Aren't you afraid? He could not help but ask. I don't know, Romaine whispered. She looked up and said, but my heart is pounding, as if it's very exciting. Sophie was speechless. This young lady's way of thinking was indeed different from ordinary people. But some people were born to take risks. Perhaps Roman was such a person. He pretended not to hear and looked back at the window. The liches had not swept their eyes in this direction, so Sophie could continue to observe without worry. There were shadows in the forest in the distance, and there should be a lot of enemies in that direction. With a rough estimate, the size of Madara's vanguard was more than 100. This was not a small number. With such a large army, there must be a necromancer's apprentice secretly controlling them. In his opinion, this was simply bad news. In the game, a necromancer's apprentice in Madara was equivalent to a level 10 player. Even if they were alone, 7 or 8 well-trained adult men, soldiers or militia, would not be their opponent. Not to mention, there were only 2 of them, and the Roman had an army under his command. Sophie could not help but tap on the window sill with his finger. It would take at least 5 minutes for Butchie's guards to arrive here, which meant that if they encountered an enemy, they would have to defend themselves for at least 5 minutes before reinforcements arrived. This was under the condition that Butchie would discover that they were being attacked. But how could he warn them? He could not help but feel a little troubled. The best way was to set a fire. The bright fire and smoke would spread far in the dark, and the fire would be a clear warning to both humans and animals. But whether to set a fire, and how to set a fire, was still a problem. Brando. Will we die? It's hard to say. Silence fell in the dark room. The darkness was deep and serene, and only the cold moonlight from the corner of the window shone in, creating a small silver path in the dark house. Sophie pondered for a moment, and was about to close the curtains and calm down to think of a way to escape. But at this moment, a conversation came from outside. Where is that pitiful worm's corpse? Bring him out for me to see. Didn't the information say that there were only 2 women living in this manor? First, it was a young man's voice, but it was somewhat cold and sharp. The voice that followed sounded dry and old, like the cracking of broken dead wood. He's just an unlucky wretch, master. This conversation made Sophie's heart tighten. He looked outside again, and quickly found the source of the 2 voices under the shadow of a large tree. There, a guy wearing a loose black robe was talking to his underling, the necromancer. Sophie's gaze quickly fell on the other person's cuffs. He could vaguely see a circle of grayish-white bone decorations, which proved that the other person was indeed a necromancer's apprentice. He was not wrong. Remember, I don't need your opinions. You just need to do as you're told. The necromancer under the black robe suddenly stopped talking and looked up at Sophie. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately closed the curtains. Oh no, he thought that he was a veteran warrior over level 130, and had completely forgotten that the necromancer's perception and level of concealment were much higher than his. This way, he would not be discovered immediately, but it would definitely arouse the necromancer's suspicion. Sure enough, he immediately heard the necromancer say from outside, "Okay, hurry up and do it. I feel that there's a living person in the house. Be careful, these days I've been suspecting that the necromancer has discovered our plan. Oh no, the necromancer will take action as soon as they notice that Brando's corpse is missing." Sophie's mind raced. He immediately thought of the door behind the kitchen. But Elsingolan was a natural pasture, and there was no place to hide in the vicinity. There was a small forest at the bottom of the hill, but there was also a slope of more than 100 meters without any shelter. What should he do? Brando. Romain looked at him with a questioning gaze. Follow me. Sophie gritted his teeth, and decided to take it one step at a time. He opened the door. Just then, he saw a necromancer and two skeleton soldiers entering the hall. The necromancer in a woven robe immediately noticed him and the Roman. The necromancer immediately raised the bone staff in its hand, but Sophie reacted faster than it. The young man did not hesitate to raise his right hand and pointed the ring on his index finger at the necromancer. OSS. Note, in the ancient language of Vaughn's, wind. He could only pray that the ring was still useful. Fortunately, Sophie immediately felt the ring warm up, and the air in front of him seemed to suddenly expand, and then there was a loud crash. As if a hurricane had swept through, the necromancer, the two skeleton soldiers beside it, and the door of the mansion shattered into pieces. Countless wood chips, stone fragments, and bone fragments expanded outwards in an instant, and then fluttered down like butterflies fluttering in the sky. At the moment of the explosion, 5 golden light spots flew out from the necromancer's and skeleton soldiers' bodies, and quickly merged into Sophie's chest. All of this happened in the blink of an eye, and even the young man himself did not notice it. But after the explosion, only a huge radioactive pattern was left on the ground. Everything quieted down, and Sophie was so shocked that she didn't know what to do. In the game, the wind bomb caused 30 points of air damage, and it was more than enough to kill the necromancer and skeleton soldiers, but the effect was not that exaggerated, right? There was a huge hole in the door of the old mansion, which was his grandfather's property. But Sophie did not think that it was over, and he immediately realized that he had to escape. Brando, you're a wizard. The Roman shouted in surprise. No, I'll explain to you later. He took a deep breath, pulled the other person and rushed downstairs. The kitchen was on the first floor, and he had to reach there before the other person could react. Wait, Brando, I can't keep up with you. Be careful, we're going downstairs. Ah! The sudden explosion caused the skeletons outside to turn their heads, but they lacked intelligence, and only instinctively reacted to the sound. Thus, they stood there without moving, passively waiting for the necromancer's orders. The necromancer's green phosphorescence suddenly jumped, and it immediately raised its bone staff, and a small flame flashed on the top of the staff. Don't use fire, you idiot. The black-robed wizard who suddenly appeared pressed down on the necromancer's bone staff, and gritted his teeth as he scolded. The previous explosion had probably attracted the attention of the people of Butchie, and if there was a fire now, it would only alert the people in the village. He immediately turned his head and pointed towards the house. Soldiers, catch those two guys. With a swoosh, the skeletons uniformly pulled out their long swords, and then rushed into the house. Sophie had already rushed down the stairs at this time, and when he saw the skeletons outside and the countless red dots in the darkness, he couldn't help but feel his scalp tingle. But he was not a level 100 veteran warrior, and the ring in his hand was in a state of charging, so he could only brace himself. Once he was surrounded by these skeletons, he would probably be chopped into minced meat. Misfortune never comes alone. Sophie couldn't help but feel a wave of helplessness. The pain in his chest was terrible, but he still rushed to the kitchen before the skeletons. The young man immediately closed the door, and before he could breathe a sigh of relief, a few sharp swords pierced through the door. Fortunately, he retracted his hand quickly, or else he would have been nailed to the door. That was close. Sophie's heart thumped, and he looked around. The other side of the kitchen was the exit, but he knew that he couldn't just leave like that. He had to think of a way to warn the people of Butchie, and only then could he save his life. Also, the fire could block the low-level undead. Brando. The merchant girl bent over to catch her breath, and she couldn't help but raise her head to look at Brando. She had never seen such a decisive and brave side of him, and couldn't help but be surprised. Miss Roman, please guard the door. Sophie was not in the mood to explain anything at this time, and he had to seize every minute and second. Crack, 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 the skeletons on the other side began to attack the wooden door of the kitchen. This door was not originally prepared for defense, and soon there were a few holes in it. Me? Roman blinked. Yes, give me some time. What are you doing? The merchant girl asked curiously. I have to think of a way to warn the people in the village that this is Madara's undead army, and we have to warn the others. Sophie tried to calm himself down, and he answered while he rummaged around to look for the flint. He remembered where he had put it. Okay, I'll do it. Roman immediately walked over and stood between Sophie and the door. Will it be okay? Of course. The merchant girl waved the masonry hammer in her hand, and said matter-of-factly, I'll do my best, I'll become a great merchant in the future. Sophie stopped, looked at her, and couldn't help but nod. You will, Miss Roman. Yes, Brando. P.S. 2 updates a day, that's enough. I hope there are fewer irresponsible comments in the book review section. Thank you for your help. I hope there are more meaningful book reviews in the book review section. Can everyone support me a little more? This book is still on page 42 of the new book, Poor. Chapter 15. That was Sophie's plan. If his memory served him right, Butchie's guard captain should be the famous veteran, Martin. He was a veteran who had experienced the November War, just like Brando's grandfather. Sophie knew about him because this NPC would teach the traveler the inspect skill in the game. But the reason why this veteran was famous was because during the First War of the Black Rose, he made a huge mistake as the guard captain of Butchie. He misjudged the purpose of Madara's army. He thought that the enemy was just going to invade the borders as usual, so he moved the villagers of Butchie away. He originally had a chance to fight back and defeat the undead army's vanguard, and then retreat with ease. Unfortunately, this opportunity was missed by him. He should have become a hero of the kingdom, but in the end, he walked on a dark path. Sophie was both amazed and curious about such a person. He was amazed at the latter situation in the latter half of his life, but he was curious about how he discovered Madara's undead army in the first place. After all, this was the only variable in the entire Grimoires region. Could it be because of me? An impossible thought popped into Sophie's mind. But he immediately threw this ridiculous thought out of his mind. Now he wanted to change history, and he had to think of a way to remind the enemy. Fire, in military regulations, symbolized warning and invasion. Sophie could only hope that the enemy was awake enough. Banging sounds could be heard outside the door, and as the seconds passed, it was as if they were immersed in a tense atmosphere. Brando, they're coming in. The Roman held the masonry hammer tightly with both hands, and she frowned as she stared at the kitchen door, as if she was afraid that it would be accidentally knocked open. Sophie did not have the time to think about this. Once the skeleton soldiers swarmed in, they would be dead. But when he heard Romain's shout, he could not help but turn back to look at the door. The kitchen door made a creaking sound, and sharp swords were constantly being stabbed and pulled out. Madara's swords were as sharp as the fangs of a beast. Something outside suddenly hit the door, and with a loud bang, a layer of dust fell from the roof. The wooden door creaked and groaned, and the crack widened a lot in an instant. Calm down, calm down. Just treat it as a game. Sophie, think about all the missions you've been through. This time, it's nothing. He tried to take a deep breath to calm himself down. He wrapped the cloth soaked in oil around a bundle of straw and firewood, and tied it tightly with a leather band. He was very familiar with the process. Making a torch was a basic skill in the game, although it wasn't even a basic skill. This was one of the better ones. He also knew how to make a torch that could only burn for 5 minutes. He remembered that he had tried it once in the underground tunnels of Nocturne and Hain using dry lichens and shrubs. However, there was not much time left for him. Soon, the door shook violently again, and the door frame made a loud creaking sound. Dust flew everywhere, and then fell down in a flurry. Brando! Roman felt her heart was about to jump out of her throat. She blinked her bright eyes. I'm here. Don't worry, just hold on a little longer. Sophie was sweating profusely. He used the iron bar to saw the flint several times. Sparks flew everywhere, but he still couldn't light the torch. After all, there were some differences between reality and the game. The huge strength of the skeleton soldier first made the latch unable to withstand the force. It broke from the middle with a crack. The wooden door tilted, but it still didn't open. A bare skeleton hand reached in from the outside, intending to break the latch from the inside. The young merchant was shocked. She immediately raised her hammer and swung it, but the hammer hit the skeleton with a bang. The skeleton soldier of Madara didn't feel any pain. It paused for a moment, and then continued to pull the latch. Roman saw this scene and was stunned for a moment. She even forgot about the hammer in her hand. Brando, what should we do? She immediately asked nervously. At this time, the flame finally lit up. At the same time, the latch fell to the ground with a clang. The door opened, and the skeleton soldier outside with a sword pushed the door open and stepped in. It turned its head, and the 2 red flames in its black eye sockets locked onto the 2 pale-faced young men. What was the young man doing? Before it could react, a black object grew larger and larger in the undead's hazy vision. Immediately, a hatchet was inserted into its head with a click. This is your last move. When you throw the sword, remember to keep your hand steady and your center of gravity low. Don't hesitate. You must try to form a straight line between you and your target. If your enemy is a skeleton, then your best target is the joint between the shoulder blade and the arm, the thigh, or the spine. Unless you are confident that you can decapitate it, the skull is not its biggest weakness. What the hell? Sophie looked at the skeleton soldier that was leaning backward and couldn't help but curse in his heart. The throwing technique in military swordsmanship was a profound skill, but for a veteran warrior like him, it was not a problem. But when he threw the hatchet, Sophie suddenly remembered that he was no longer a veteran. In the game, with his strength, the hatchet would have split the skeleton in half along its skull. But now, just like what Brando learned in the militia training, the skeleton would only be slightly hindered. A hatchet inserted into the skull would not cause any damage to the skeleton's overall structure. Miss Roman, be careful. Seeing that the skeleton was about to stand up again, he immediately pulled Romaine, who was in a daze, behind him. Brando. Romaine was scared out of her wits. Don't worry, I'm here. Although Sophie said that, he was actually not very confident, especially when he saw the dense crowd of skeleton soldiers that were about to rush in. In such a critical situation, he couldn't care less. He looked around, but there was nothing he could use. But the skeleton was about to stand up. What should he do? Should he just give up like that? Sophie shook his head. He swore that he had never been so reckless in his life. Of course, the experience in the game didn't count. He only felt that his heart was blank. He could only take a gamble. If he didn't succeed, he would die for a righteous cause. He rushed forward, gritted his teeth, and grabbed the skeleton's arm that was holding the sword. Then, almost subconsciously, he threw the skeleton backwards. In a tense situation, people would often use all their strength subconsciously. The skeleton lost its balance and could not resist at all. It fell backward with a creak, and the skeleton soldiers behind it were all pushed back. Madara's undead that were rushing into the room stopped for a moment. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. The young man couldn't help but feel confused. He almost couldn't believe that he had succeeded. This was reality. Was he really that useless gaming geek? He subconsciously threw the torch in his other hand at the dry straw, leather products, and firewood that had been piled up in the corner to ignite the fire. The flame rose up in an instant. "Let's run, Brando." Romaine ran up from behind and grabbed his hand. She felt that she had never been so nervous in her life. She remembered that the first time she met the young man next door was more than a year ago. She only felt that he was a little shy and easy to talk to. But today, that ordinary young man had shown extraordinary calmness and bravery. Was this the reliable man that Auntie had been whispering about, the kind of temperament that he had shown in the face of danger? What a strange feeling. Romaine couldn't help but have some inexplicable thoughts. She noticed that when she grabbed the young man's wrist, her heart couldn't help but beat faster. Brando. The smoke had already filled the air, and the kitchen was filled with the choking smell of smoke. Only then did Sophie wake up with a start. Martha above, he actually burned down her grandfather's old house. Brando would have to bear the consequences this time, even though he was Brando now. His mind was in a mess, but Brando's memories still prevailed in the chaos. But soon, a dry, low voice came from behind the smoke. "Hurry up, undead soldiers. Put out the fire and get that bug out. We've only got a minute." The voice reminded the young man that he was still in danger and had to find a way to escape. But Sophie knew that the low-level undead that were powered by the soul fire were instinctively afraid of fire. It would be difficult for the Lich to get his skeletons to overcome this in a short time, so this was his turn. But fire was a double-edged sword, and he had to hurry. "Miss Roman, follow me." Sophie pulled a roll of sausages from the ceiling and led Romaine to the back door. It wasn't that he was greedy, but it was almost a subconscious instinct for the players in the Amber Sword to prepare food before escaping. The fire was getting bigger and bigger, and the surroundings were in a sea of fire. Smoke filled the air, and the temperature rose rapidly. But Sophie quickly found the small door that delivered food in his memory. He pushed it and it was locked. Sophie coughed, and Romaine coughed violently behind him. He calmed himself down and fell down, and immediately found the metal latch. He was about to open it, but hesitated. Something else occurred to him. Freya. Perhaps for the people living in the Elsingolan Mountains, the stars in April were not much different from the night sky in May. But since the end of the 5th month, the temperature had gradually risen. Looking down from the gentle slope of the Pine Mountain Range, it had been a sea of red and white flowers since the beginning of summer. In times of peace, this was the most peaceful countryside in all of Aween, but for hundreds of years, it had been ravaged by the flames of war. The girl looked up. In the summer night, the sky was crystal clear. From the west to the east, a bright belt of light ran through the night sky, passing through the many mythical constellations. She was standing at the entrance of the village, looking up at the mountain. Freya was a little worried. The loud noise from before was particularly unsettling. Recently, there were rumors of undead movements in the vicinity. Could it be? Hearing the shout, she turned around and was surprised to see a young boy running out of the village. He ran to her side in a panic and bent down, gasping for breath. "What's wrong, Petite Finesse, what happened?" The girl's voice was soft and clear. "Did you hear the sound just now?" "Yes, that's why I came out to take a look." She could not help but look in the direction of the hillside. "I'm really worried about the Roman. Her aunt also went to the nearby town. I heard that it's not very safe recently. I asked her to stay at my house for 2 days, but she didn't agree." The boy looked up at her and could not help but widen his eyes. The girl's light brown hair was tied into a simple ponytail at the back of her head, which set off her heroic figure. She was wearing a tight gray leather armor with a thick cotton shirt inside. On her left shoulder was an armband with an abstract pine leaf painted with black paint. She also had a short sword at her waist. It was a medieval Western European short sword. The iron plate on the sword guard had a flame emblem. If Sophie was here, she would be able to recognize her attire at a glance. Butchie's militia. The Golan black pine was the most common tree in the Elsen-Golan Mountains, and it was also the emblem of the local forces in Butchie. However, the guards were well equipped and equipped with battle robes. Only the local militia would wear the gray leather armor sewn with the fur of the gray mane cow. In Erewhon, every local youth would receive militia training. This training usually started when they were 14 years old, between October and March every year, and would only end when they were 19 years old. Youths and even adults who had received the training could become militia at any time during peacetime, and become the most important backup during wartime. Therefore, ever since the decree was issued during the Year of Thunder, militia training became one of the most important military measures in Erewhon. "Doesn't that kid live there? I heard that he was a militia in Braggs." The boy was puzzled. "TSK, the people in the city are not trustworthy." The girl flipped her long ponytail and could not help but frown. "It's because that guy is there that I don't feel at ease." "You're just prejudiced, Sister Freya. What do you know?" "Forget it." The girl lectured without turning her head. "All right, if you have something to say, say it quickly. Boys shouldn't talk too much like girls, okay?" Petit Finesse shrunk his neck. "Did you know, Captain Martin has already ordered the guards to gather?" Freya's bright eyes flashed with a hint of surprise. "Captain Martin? How did you know?" "That guy Breton told me." Petit Finesse blinked and replied. "When I came out, he was already on his horse reporting to the guards." "Do you know what happened?" "I don't know." The boy shook his head. The girl turned her head and looked at the direction of the hillside worriedly. In the darkness, she could only vaguely see the outline of the manor. "Wake everyone up, we're going to." "Freya, it's so late, Aunt Syl will kill us." The boy widened his eyes and asked in disbelief. "Let's wait for tomorrow's news." "What a coward." The girl couldn't help but glare at him, but she also knew that Petit Finesse was telling the truth. Thinking of her aunt's deterrence, even though she was the captain of Butchie's militia, she still didn't dare to act rashly. "Aren't you the same?" The boy just muttered, but he saw the girl turn her head and solemnly signal him to keep quiet. "Freya." "Shoo!" The girl tilted her head and made a listened gesture. In the darkness, there was clearly a faint whining sound. "What's that sound?" The whining sound came from afar. It was above her head and was very fast. The girl's face changed. She raised her head and wanted to avoid it, but it was too late. A black shadow suddenly plunged down from the sky and drilled into her shoulder, causing her to scream and fall backwards. "Big sister! Run, Petit Finesse, run!" The ponytailed girl shouted in pain. Arrows fell like rain. Sophie stopped. "What's wrong, Brando? Cough cough." The future merchant girl probably felt that something was wrong and couldn't help but ask. Sophie didn't answer. He remembered something. When Madara launched the attack, it was in the game. In the game, it was inevitable that they couldn't avoid the players. Unlike the NPCs, players didn't work at sunrise and rest at sunset. It could even be said that a considerable number of them were true nocturnal creatures. He remembered that when Madara launched the operation, there were also players in other places who interfered with them. Players like himself, but most of Madara's operations were successful. Why? Yes, he finally remembered such an era. When the ancient country of Erewhon was dying, its neighbors were ushering in such an era, a turbulent era. A gathering of generals, Sophie couldn't help but sigh. In this era of Madara, not only was there an endless stream of legendary generals whose names would shake the continent, but it also benefited from the military reforms 7 years ago, year 368, the Black Rose Revolution. This reform created a solid foundation for it, and it cultivated an endless stream of excellent apprentices that supported the country's war strength from the bottom. And this strength would eventually be displayed in such a war. In the First Black Rose War, Madara's army showed strong execution and judgment that was enough to make everyone look askance. But unfortunately, until the fall of Erewhon, the world didn't have any real vigilance. That was exactly the case. The country in the darkness was rising, and soon it would be like the sun in the sky. Those guys are not ordinary. As an old enemy, Sophie had a deep impression of Madara's outstanding officers. Only those who had fought with them for a long time would know how shrewd they were. Sophie's hand rested on the cold door latch, and his heart turned cold. The moment he closed the door, the enemy would have already launched an attack on Butchie. They wouldn't give him the time to provide an alarm to the village, even if it was just a possibility. And there might be Madara's skeleton soldiers behind the door. What should he do? P.S. This chapter is 5,000 words. Be kind. Make a wish. If I can make it to the front page tomorrow, I'll add a chapter on top of the double update. Chapter 16. Lord Marsa, my soldiers have opened the door, but the inside has already been set ablaze. My skeletons hesitated in front of the filthy flames, and I need some time for them to get used to it. The necromancer lowered its head, and the green flames in its eye sockets flashed with a cunning light. However, it placed its withered arm in front of its chest to express its absolute obedience. Madara had a strict hierarchy, and anyone who tried to overstep it would feel fear from the depths of their soul. Especially the necromancers behind the Black Codex, who were naturally good at manipulating and playing with the pain of the soul. The necromancer's apprentice used his pale and slender fingers to lightly tap on his dark black silk robe. He stood on the hill and looked down at the village below. In the darkness, Butchie's bell was ringing, and the human society was in deep fear. However, this was just the beginning of a nightmare. Not far away, rows of skeletons were disappearing into the darkness. On the side of the forest, there was a reserve team hidden. He ordered them to shoot arrows, and soon, the first wave would be released. The next wave would be arrows with fire. Blue flames, cold soul flames. The raging flames in the darkness would cause all living things to panic. He wanted to create a little panic so that the skeletons would attack. How much time? The future necromancer's voice was cold and sharp. The necromancer lowered its head and estimated, 8 minutes, no, at most 5 minutes. I don't have that time, but I can leave a team of people for you. 11 skeletons, is that enough, Kabuka? Plenty, my master. The future necromancer smiled coldly, be careful, don't let the rats escape from the back door. Master, please be at ease. I have already arranged the back door according to Master's orders. Then, I hope that when I return in triumph, I will receive good news, Kabuka. The necromancer's apprentice pointed forward and looked at his subordinates meaningfully. Now, I will accept the surrender of this village and taste the eternal death of humans in fear. However, in the name of Martha, I hope that my decision to attack early will not bring any trouble to Sir Insursta, As you wish, my master. The necromancer lowered its head deeply. Thick smoke billowed in the room, and from time to time, flames would lick out from under the smoke. The rising flames not only blocked the invasion of the undead, but also blocked the sight of humans. The rising temperature had already scorched their backs, and the hot smoke made it hard for them to open their eyes. Their throats and noses were stinging, but Sophie's heart was still cold. What should he do? What happened? Give me the hammer. The young man finally stretched out his hand. He listened, and in addition to the flaying and burning of the flames, he faintly heard a unique sound echoing through the mountains, the sound of a bell. Butchie's alarm. Martha above, I hope the village guards are smart enough. Sophie prayed silently in her heart. As for the militia, he didn't count on them. They were just hot-blooded young people. He only hoped that they could survive the night. These people were Erwin's future seeds. He immediately felt that he might have been overthinking things. Perhaps he wouldn't even be able to pass the next stage. Are there enemies outside? Romaine blinked her eyes and handed the hammer over. It's hard to say, but it's better to be prepared. Sophie tried to think positively, but the better he thought, the worse the situation would be. He had to be prepared. He was a veteran warrior, and veteran warriors didn't rely on luck, but on caution. Brando. Yes. He stopped opening the door. You seem a little different today. Had he been exposed? Sophie's heart tightened. But that's not right. Logically speaking, his personality was quite similar to Brando's, and he also inherited the latter's memories. How could he be exposed so quickly? What? He couldn't help but ask nervously. Yes, I can't really explain it. It's just a feeling. The future Romaine thought for a moment, and replied seriously, You will protect me, right, Brando? Is there a problem? No, thank you. You don't have to treat me as a good person, Miss Roman. Sophie smiled faintly and didn't reply, but the tension in her heart had dissipated by quite a bit. He took a deep breath, tensed his body, and gently unlatched the door. Then he placed his hand on the cold doorknob. It was about to open. What kind of fate awaited him outside? A whole new world. Or a sudden death? God, you wouldn't play with me like this, right? But trying to figure out Martha's intentions was a big taboo. Miss Roman, I'll count to 3, and you'll rush out with me. Okay. 3, oh. Ouch. Sorry, I was too nervous, I should have counted, it's okay, Brando. Roman couldn't help but cover her face. She was blushing when she bumped into the young man's solid back, and her heart was thumping. She wasn't such a shy person before. But Sophie wasn't in the mood to understand the girl's thoughts. He was a little embarrassed to have made such a mistake. He remembered that he was supposed to be very calm. It was just a few small skeletons. He gritted his teeth and opened the door. Before the smoke cleared, a shining sword had already pierced in. There was an ambush. Sophie's heart had never been so calm before. It was as if the 31 years of experience of being a warrior in the game had merged with his life in this world. The black rose emblem of Brimanter on the iron plate was so eye-catching in his eyes. Madara's sword drew a dazzling straight line. Stiff. Sophie knew where the opponent's weakness was. He also knew that he couldn't fight with his strength. He immediately pressed the Roman's back and dodged to the side. It was just a hair's breadth away, and the cold sword cut through his clothes. After that, Sophie swung her hammer forward. After the smoke and dust parted, a skeleton's chest was revealed. With a crisp crack, 3 ribs were broken at the same time. The skeleton couldn't withstand the force and staggered backward. The young man took the opportunity to rush out of the sea of fire. He immediately looked around the battlefield. There were 4 skeleton soldiers. He couldn't help but gasp. If there were only 1 or 2 skeletons, he might have had the mood to curse. But at this moment, his heart was cold. It seemed that God knew his nature very well. He only had one thought left. The opponent really thought highly of him. He must have been dealt with as a scout. That was also true. Sophie thought that his performance was not inferior to the average human scout. Because in such a small place, even if there were scouts, they would only be ordinary hunters. But it seemed that it was not a good thing to stand out too much. He felt Roman holding his hand tightly from behind. The girl's subconscious actions revealed her nervousness. He wanted to say something to comfort her, but he didn't know what to say. He looked up. The dark forest was just below the hillside. But how could he cross the distance in the middle? He didn't have wings. The mountain wind blew, and his wet forehead was cold. The 4 skeleton soldiers had already surrounded him. What should I do? Close my eyes and wait for death. Sophie could only subconsciously protect Romain behind him. He couldn't help but think that it would be good if he was still a level 130 warrior. Dealing with these skeletons would be a piece of cake. But there were no ifs in this world. Reality was really detestable. Wait, level. The young man suddenly realized that he seemed to have overlooked something. His heart couldn't help but tremble. Yes, the Ring of the Wind Empress. He clearly used the Ring of the Wind Empress to kill a lich and 2 skeletons. In addition to the skeleton that Brando killed before he died, he had 6 experience points. In the game, a swordsman only needed 5 experience points to level up from level 1 to level 2. His only hope was that this place was not too different from the game. 6 experience points, the omnipotent and omniscient Martha. As long as he had a new level, he would have a chance to escape. Sophie knew that he didn't have much time. The 4 skeletons were already in front of him. He might only have a breath's time, for seconds, to live or die. He used the fastest speed imaginable to cast a piece of dark green data on his retina. XP, 6, Commoner level 1, Militia level 1, 0/3, thank God. He knew what he needed. Although it was a waste to invest experience points in a militia class, he couldn't care less at this moment. No matter how wasteful it was still better than becoming a cold corpse, wasn't it? Militia, 6 experience points, quick, let me level up. He tried his best to think in his heart. The 4 skeletons had already raised their swords. He felt Romain hugging him tightly from behind. Brando, they're coming. But the data quickly changed. XP, 0, Commoner level 1, Militia level 2, 6/10, a warm current flowed through Sophie's body. He knew that he could get 0. 1 ounce of strength and 0. 1 ounce of vitality from the militia class. But it didn't matter. It was important to know that when a swordsman leveled up from level 1 to level 2, their strength and vitality would be increased by 0. 2 ounces, not to mention their dexterity and perceptive sense. So compared to the militia class, he was useless. But it didn't matter. The important thing was that Sophie knew that when a character leveled up from level 1 to level 2, he would get 3 chances to choose his innate skill. Yes, this was the first time. It was also the fairest time. This was the first time he would be reborn. He waited anxiously, 1 second felt like 10,000 years. But finally, the insignia that represented his innate skill lit up on his status panel. Innate skill, unyielding. Sophie's eyes lit up with a blazing flame. For swords were on his body, but he only symbolically raised his masonry hammer, avoiding his head, heart, and other important parts. Pu. At least 3 swords stabbed into the young man's body at the same time. He only felt one thing, it was F*King painful. But Sophie knew that with his innate skill, he wouldn't faint from blood loss for at least 5 minutes, and he definitely wouldn't die from any physical attacks for at least half an hour. Now he only had one chance, and that was to bring Roman away from here, and then use the remaining time to find a life potion. He didn't know if there was such a thing in this world, but he could only believe that there was. Because he had no other choice. Brando. Roman was so scared that his voice changed. Hold on tight to me, Roman. Hold on tight to me. The young man didn't have time to explain, he couldn't help but burst out in anger. Brando, who was covered in blood, looked like a real hero at this moment. The girl couldn't help but stare blankly at him. I know, I'm sorry, Brando. Sophie took a deep breath. He didn't know how many times he had done this, but he really needed to calm down first. Although taking a breath made him feel as if his wounds were being torn apart, he understood that the pain was just an illusion. The 3 skeletons pulled out their swords, they were stunned for a moment. Because in their eyes, this human was gradually losing the heat of life, and another kind of power was spreading out from his body. The power of the soul. The innate skill of unyielding will unearth the fire of the soul from within. It was similar to driving the undead away. Therefore, the undead thought that Sophie was one of their kind, but there was a misunderstanding here. Because Sophie didn't think so. He clenched his teeth and swung his sledgehammer, sending the 4 skeletons flying. This wasn't because the young man's strength suddenly increased, but because it was completely out of the opponent's expectations. Sophie grabbed Roman's hand and took this opportunity to quickly rush out. Miss Roman, he said with difficulty while running. Yes. Listen carefully, Sophie said while gasping for breath. The innate skill didn't overdraw his physical strength, he already felt that the scenery around him was somewhat blurred. Only the whistling sound of the wind was left in his ears because he was running. If I faint, bring me to Butchie, be careful to avoid Madara. Go to the holy temple in town, find health potions, do you understand? I understand, Brando. You won't die, right? I don't know, cough. Let's see what Master Martha arranges. Sophie didn't know if Romain really understood, but he only had the strength to say so much, the rest was just like what he said, let's leave it to fate. He couldn't help but turn his head, in a blur, the fire on the hillside was soaring to the sky. He sighed and closed his eyes tiredly. Was he really that otaku who was addicted to games? Perhaps at this moment, the life of the past was really far away from him. He really couldn't believe that there would be a day when he was so brave and decisive. Maybe even if he died like this, he would feel at ease. Because I'm no longer a useless person, P.S. Can today's results let me watch at midnight? Let's wait and see. I hope that there will be fewer crappy book reviews in the book review section, and more meaningful book reviews like Marshall Shinglong's. Chidian website welcomes all readers to read. The latest, fastest, and most popular series are all at Chidian Originals. Chapter 17. Sophie felt like he was in a long dream. In a quiet and dark environment, everything in the dream seemed bizarre. However, there was only a black moon, a dark lake, and a tall tower that stood silently in the middle of the dream. Did the moon symbolize something? What did the tower symbolize? Or was it just a nightmare? Sophie did not know, just like he did not know when he would wake up. This state lasted until he heard a conversation in a daze. Freya. Brayden, have you contacted him? It was a girl's voice, bright and clear. No, there's a group of monsters guarding the road. We can't find where Uncle Martin and the others went, and this guy. The second voice was still a child, and the source of the voice turned to him. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, and he seemed to feel a gaze on him. This gaze was like a link to the world, causing his body to gradually sink. The next moment, the young man realized that it was gravity. Sophie finally confirmed that he could feel his body, although it was still not under his control. His breathing was a little erratic. Was he dead? He's injured, take care of him. The girl's voice replied. Injured? Was it talking about him? Yes, he was seriously injured. His thoughts became clear, and everything that happened before was like an early movie in his mind. From the moment he was reborn in the body of the young man named Brando, Sophie never thought that he would one day be able to risk his life to do something. It did not seem like a decision that an otaku would make. But he succeeded in the end, for Martha's sake. Freya, he's awake. The child suddenly said. What? I saw his eyelids move. That's impossible. He was seriously injured. Mackie said. Ah. Seriously injured. Indeed, Brando was already seriously injured, and later when he activated his ability, he was stabbed 3 times. He remembered clearly that each of the stabs to his lower abdomen and right chest were genuine piercing wounds. Sophie's mind became active, and with a thought, the sounds around him became clear. The sound of panicked shouts, the crackling of the flames, the clashing of metal, and the sound of footsteps mixed together to drown out the previous conversation. The surrounding temperature gradually rose. At first, he felt a warm heat licking his face, but after a while, the temperature gradually became hot. Hot. He blinked his eyes and struggled to open his eyelids. The first thing he saw was a girl's shocked face. The girl who should be called Freya, Sophie's first impression of her completely matched his imagination of the owner of the bright and clear voice. She had light brown hair, big bright eyes, and her long hair was tied into a ponytail, which accentuated her heroic face. She was looking at him with her head lowered, and Sophie was also looking at her at the same time. She wore a close-fitting gray-white leather armor with a thick cotton shirt underneath. On her left shoulder was an armband with a beautiful black pine leaf painted on it with native paint. Butchie's militia. He also noticed the sword in the girl's hand. It was a medieval Western European sword, and the iron plate on the sword guard had a flame emblem. It was the symbol of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He looked up and saw the blood-stained bandages on the other side of her shoulder and left chest. Had she been in a battle? Every detail could not escape Sophie's eyes. When he woke up, the surroundings suddenly became quiet. Where is this place? Where's the Roman, cough cough? Sophie felt as if a soldering iron had fallen into his throat, burning and dry. The pain in his chest gradually spread to his whole body, and he could not help but cough softly. But the forest was quiet, and the only response he got was the sound of the wind from the Pine Mountain Range. But the sound of the wind passed through the thick needles of the grand black pine, and became soft and gentle. The rustling sound was like a small river flowing by his ears. No one answered. He's awake. I can't believe that he could survive with that kind of injury. It must be the final radiance of the setting sun. Only then did the whispers around him reach his ears. Sophie was a little confused. What's going on? These people should be Butchie's militia, right? Was he saved by the other party? Then what about the merchant lady? Did the plan succeed? Did Captain Martin understand what I meant? He could not help but turn his head. The first thing that entered his eyes was a bright bonfire. The flames danced in his vision, and the sparks rose up along the black pine, disappearing into the night sky. You're awake. The girl finally reacted and hurriedly stopped him. Wait, don't move. This is Butchie, do you remember? Butchie. Butchie. Sophie repeated the name of the place. Can you tell me what happened? He exhaled. Logically speaking, he was already dead, no matter if it was in the game or in real life. The only possibility was that the Roman lady had really found the health potion. Petit Phineas and Mackie found you in the forest not far away. Freya looked at him curiously. Although this young man called Brando had been in their village for almost a year, he did not have much contact with the other young people in the village. He always stayed in his dark house alone, and only occasionally accompanied the Roman to the nearby town. Even a fool in the nearby area would know that this young man was interested in the girl who dreamed of being a merchant. Of course, the latter was an exception. When Freya thought of this, she could not help but look at him again with a trace of suspicion. "You too?" Sophie asked. "You and the Roman, I really wonder how you escaped." The girl could not help but sigh. "What's wrong with her?" "She's fine. Don't worry, she's 10,000 times better than you. You should be more concerned about your own situation." Freya touched his forehead and asked softly, "But she keeps saying that she wants to go to the village. Do you know what's going on?" Sophie was startled. In other words, he had not used the health potion. Then what about his injuries? As if it was an instinctive reaction, he subconsciously opened his status interface. Dark green data flowed on his retina, and in the character status column, he was stunned to see a line of small words: health, near death, weak 10%, bandaged, recovers 1 health point per day, impossible. Sophie's first reaction was to think that he was dreaming. No one knew his own condition better than he did. There were fatal wounds all over his body, and he was bleeding profusely. No matter how he looked at it, he should be dead for sure. How could he still have 10% of his health? Sophie shook his head, trying to clear his mind, but he saw the girl beside him with a nervous expression. "Don't move, you're heavily injured." "Don't worry." He waved his hand subconsciously. Sophie was clear about his own condition. Although he had some doubts, he was not in a state of blood loss, and there were no other abnormalities. Although he was still weak and near death, he knew that he could not rush it. He could only rely on slowly recuperating. Because his injuries were stable, at least his life was not in danger. And this was what he was most confused about. How did his injury stabilize? The unyielding talent did not have this ability. "You?" Freya could not help but widen her eyes. She had never seen someone who did not care about his life. At first, everyone thought that this guy was dead for sure, but they didn't expect him to wake up. Just this alone should be enough to thank Mother Marcia for her favor, right? The problem was that this despicable guy still didn't seem to care at all. He should cherish his own life. "Lie back down." The girl could not help but take a deep breath and ordered with gritted teeth. Sophie was stunned and could not help but look at the girl. What was wrong with this girl? You also received militia training, right?" "My name is Freya, and I'm the leader of Butchie's 3rd militia unit. I'm requesting you to listen to my orders for the time being." Freya's face reddened as she realized she had lost her composure. "Is that all right?" "You are Freya." Sophie was shocked and blurted out, "Freya Alicia, born in the year of the Moonflower, your father is the great knight Everton." What's wrong?" The girl was stunned by the series of questions. "No, that's not right, my father is only a carpenter in town." Suddenly there was a burst of laughter. "Freya, this kid's flirting skills are very good. You have to be careful, big sister. No one will treat you as a mute if you speak less, Mackie, Ike." Freya turned her head back and glared at the young people. Sophie also took this opportunity to look at these people. There were 7 or 8 people in this militia team, which was in line with Erwin's organization, but the leader was actually a woman, and there was also a little brat. He looked at the tall and short woman and child beside him and felt a little emotional. It seemed that this was a special case, but in fact, it reflected that Erwin had been weakened after years of war. The revival that followed seemed bright on the surface, but it would squeeze the last bit of vitality out of this country. Sophie could not help but sigh. He had witnessed this period of history from beginning to end, but he did not expect that he would have to experience it again in this life. But perhaps he could change something. He looked at the girl beside him in a daze. That's right, Freya Alicia. Erwin's last general, who was later called the Valkyrie of the kingdom. She was the daughter of the Fire Scepter Everton, who was lost in the countryside in her early years. Later, she was recognized by the Princess Regent and became one of the top stars in this country. He did not expect that she had also experienced this war. Unfortunately, now was not the time to let the other party take the initiative. Sophie understood that he had to be responsible for his own safety, and of course, for the lives of these young people. What are you looking at? Freya turned her head, and when she met the young man's gaze, she could not help but be stunned. That gaze was not of appreciation, nor was it of adoration, as if he was looking at her as a very strange animal. Yes, he was looking at her. But who would look at a human? She was not an animal. You haven't seen a dead person yet, right? Sophie suddenly asked. Ah. I mean, are you afraid of seeing people die? No, I just... The girl was stunned and was speechless for a moment. Then my injury has nothing to do with you. Can I sit up? Sophie asked seriously. No, you can't. Why? Freya was speechless. She was indeed afraid. She was afraid of seeing someone die in front of her, no matter who it was. Compared to the future high and mighty Valkyrie shrouded in countless halos, the current Freya was just a simple country girl. She had not experienced the cruelty of war, and still simply looked forward to the good side of the world. Sophie smiled slightly. He had also not seen a dead person, but if he counted his experience in the Amber Sword, he was more than twice as much as Freya was now. He had at least experienced the pain of loss. The thoughts of the people and things of the past tossed and turned in his memory, tormenting and hesitating. It was this kind of feeling that made people mature and know how to cherish. But it also planted the seeds of hatred. So, she's just a little girl after all. What ability do you have to make me listen to you, Miss Freya? You. Sophie knew that it was not good for him to dwell on this topic. He glanced at the bandage on his chest and immediately changed the topic. Did you guys apply the bandage on my body? Big sister did it. She is the only one here who knows how to first aid. The little brat next to him rushed to answer. He looked curiously at the young man, who seemed to be very experienced. Braggs's militia was different from their small place. I can barely stop the bleeding. Don't think about moving around, I don't want to help you again. Freya immediately reminded him. In addition to stopping the bleeding, the recovery effect of the bandage could only be used once. Sophie was of course aware of this. But this time he politely replied, thank you, although your skills are a little inferior. Martha above, Freya took a deep breath. At this moment, she had the urge to strangle this smiling guy. What the hell was he trying to do? P.S. Looks like the wish of the third watch has been shattered. There are still 11 left everyone, let's continue to make wishes today. If we can reach the top 12 today, we will explode. Chapter 18. So, where exactly are we? After taking control of the conversation, Sophie began to ask for the information he wanted. He realized that he had changed a little. In the past, he could only speak so confidently in the game and easily grasp the rhythm of the conversation. Perhaps it was because he thought of this place as the world of the Amber Sword. His experience in the game was enough to make him treat these young people as if they were really children. He naturally exuded a confident temperament. This confidence unconsciously affected the others. Whether it was Freya or the others, they gradually felt a little different. Consciously or unconsciously, the focus of the conversation shifted to Sophie. Not far away, a few young people also raised their heads and looked over. This is the red pine forest, don't move. The ponytailed girl took a breath and tried to calm herself down. Sophie raised his head in surprise. As expected of the future Valkyrie, she learned to adjust her emotions so quickly. But in his opinion, she was still a little immature. Red pine forest? Wait, why are you here? Sophie was surprised again. He remembered this place was called Dwarf Valley in the game. It was the habitat of level 14 brown bears. But this place was south of Butchie, and the Butchie militia had no reason to appear in this direction. We came to find you. We are looking for the Roman lady, she is a friend of Big Sis. And the Roman is a member of the third team. Everyone's voices were all at once. You defeated Madara's advance force? Sophie looked at Freya. This was the question he was most concerned about. How is that possible? The girl looked at him in confusion. Her expression was as if to say, how could he ask such a stupid question? The guards covered the villagers and evacuated from the north. We were separated from everyone. And there were more and more monsters on the road, so we could only go south. Besides, I was worried about the Roman. So that's why you came here. Sophie felt her heart sink. The girl nodded her head naturally, her long ponytail bobbing up and down. Freya immediately felt a little strange. This young man wasn't Captain Martin, so why did she have a feeling that she was inferior in front of him? Sophie couldn't help but smack her forehead. She didn't know if she should say that these youngsters were naive or ignorant. They couldn't even protect themselves, yet they still wanted to save others. No, perhaps it should be said that he was kind-hearted. However, there was no need for unnecessary kindness on the battlefield. That would only harm oneself. Sophie fell silent. In fact, she could not help but vomit blood in her heart. He set fire to his grandfather's house to warn the village, but he didn't expect that history would follow its original path. No, it would repeat itself. Lord Marcia, what kind of joke are you trying to pull? What kind of joke is this? He sighed in his heart. What he could change was still too little. The inertia of history was not something that could be stopped with just a little bit of strength. Indeed, he had to become stronger, but before that, he had to survive. Captain Martin, oh Captain Martin, it seems that even I can't save you. Why would the Romans' Black Rose Madara attack the border before the celebration of the eternal death in May? Such an obvious premeditated plan. If there was a counterattack, there must be a demon behind it. Sophie's hopes were all dashed, making him feel a little empty. He had fought so hard before, but in the end, he found that history had not changed at all. This kind of blow was really depressing. But after all, it was only the strength of a normal person, and he had already done his best. Brando. He was in a bad mood, but a surprised voice sounded in his ear. It was as happy as a lark. Sophie turned around and saw the merchant girl with a face of disbelief and surprise appear on the side of the forest. There was also a girl wearing a gray leather armor beside her. It must be this girl who went to inform her. The Roman came to his side like a gust of wind and stared at him cautiously, as if she was afraid that he would suddenly disappear. I knew it, Brendel, you'll be fine. She sighed in relief and said happily. That's right, Brando. Freya didn't let me go back to Butchie, Then the merchant girl hurriedly explained, as if she was afraid that he would be angry. Sophie then noticed that there were still 2 glistening tear stains on her face, and couldn't help but feel his heart soften. It's okay, I'm fine now. He replied softly. Really? Really? Sophie nodded. Roman, don't touch him, Mr. Brando is seriously injured. Freya couldn't help but frown. Did these 2 know how serious the injury was? Didn't they almost die? It's okay. Although she said that, Roman stuck out her tongue and stood back. Sophie smiled. The merchant girl had such a temper. The young man looked at the two beautiful girls standing side by side, and couldn't help but feel that it was pleasing to the eye. He suddenly realized that it wasn't that there hadn't been any change, but the change was in another way. From the moment he came to this world, the world had already changed. If he didn't cross over, perhaps the merchant girl and Brando would have already met with misfortune. The bandits of Madara didn't have the heart to show mercy to the fairer sex. He looked at the others, and the young people who were with Freya. In that war, how many of them were able to survive? Sophie remembered clearly that in that war, less than 10% of the militia and guards at the border survived. But now that he was here, perhaps history should have changed. He didn't know more, but at least the people around him should have been saved. These young people were the seeds of the kingdom's future. Sophie would never allow history to repeat itself. Alright, back to the main topic. Do you know how serious the situation is now? Then the young man exhaled, trying to make himself look less uncomfortable. To be honest, what he needed the most now was rest, but the current situation obviously didn't allow it. He looked at the others. Freya and the young militia were stunned. Only Roman winked playfully. The ponytailed girl asked, puzzled. Sophie coughed twice weakly and asked, what are you going to do next? If I'm not wrong, Madara's undead must have controlled the path, right? The surroundings quieted down. How did you know? Freya was slightly stunned and looked at him in surprise. Of course I know, not only do I know, I've experienced it myself. Sophie answered in his heart. But the shocked gazes around him still made him feel a little proud. It was good to be a prophet. But this little pride couldn't hide the worry in his heart. Madara's attack in April was swift and comprehensive. He had to build a more comprehensive plan to protect himself. And these young people. The enemy Butchie was facing was the flank of Madara's army, and the commander of that army was the famous Black Lord, Insursta. Although he was still a young man in his early 20s, it was from this war that this future general gradually showed his talent. But what did he have? At this moment in history, he was just a nameless person. But Sophie understood that the only advantage he had now was his foresight. Indeed, this advantage could save his life in the following series of encounters, but he had to grasp the opportunity well. He only had two chances. One was to pass through the relatively safe valley of sharp stones. He remembered clearly that it would only be on the 17th day when Insursta's deputy Cyclops Tarkus would control this area. But the distance was too far, and he was worried that he wouldn't be able to break through before the enemy completed the encirclement. Unless there were horses, but where was he to find horses for 10 men? So there was only one way left, and that was to break through the River of Daggers before the two squadrons led by Ghoul, Weezer and White Knight, Ebden surrounded him. Until the end of April, there was only a skeleton squad led by a necromancer stationed there. He couldn't help but touch the cold ring on his index finger. As long as he had the Ring of the Wind Empress, wouldn't it be easy to break through the defense line formed by 11 skeleton soldiers and a necromancer? But before that, he had to make everyone in this militia squad listen to his orders. This was also the reason why he had been so aggressive from the start. Sophie looked at everyone again. This is a logical conjecture. As long as you have a bit of military knowledge, you will come to this conclusion. Sealing off the main road is to cut off communication and open up a path for your army. The next step is to use Butchie as the center to eliminate the remnants of Erwin's forces. He tried to make it sound as serious as possible based on his own experience. Then he paused for a moment, and said with a heavy tone, "That's us." Silence, only the sound of the others' breathing could be heard. "So, what do you plan to do now?" Sophie asked weakly. Everyone looked at each other in dismay. There were more than 10 skeleton soldiers guarding the main road to Butchie. They couldn't just kill their way out, right? Although they had a youthful confidence that these enemies were nothing, but when it came to a life-and-death battle, they were still a little anxious. Freya had a worried expression. She didn't think so much when she made the decision. Although they were militia, in the end they were just a group of inexperienced youths. Although the ponytailed girl didn't say anything, her helplessness was written all over her face. Everyone's gaze had already landed on Sophie. Sophie's experience made him seem more stable than everyone here. This kind of impression was often imperceptible, and in times of crisis, he made people feel more reliable. Brando? Roman also asked. Sophie turned his head, and used a faint smile to signal her to be at ease. We have to prepare for the worst. Then he turned his head to look at these people, intending to dispel their naivety. This wasn't the first time he did this. In the guild, the newbies who went to the battlefield for the first time always had an optimistic attitude, and once they suffered a blow, they would fall into a state of helplessness, so they would quickly crumble in front of an experienced team. In fact, the gap between players wasn't as big as imagined. The key was the mentality. And these old players were responsible for giving the newbies a heads-up beforehand. Prepare for the worst. Sophie was about to speak, but suddenly there was a sparse sound from the forest. Everyone looked in that direction at the same time, and only Freya frowned slightly. She asked in the direction of the shrub, Jonasen. It's me, Captain Freya. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief. But Sophie quietly waved his hand at the ponytailed girl, indicating the latter to be more vigilant. Freya saw his gesture and was slightly startled, but she immediately reacted. Erwin's militia training didn't allow them to leave their posts at will. And Sophie absolutely trusted the military training of Erwin's militia. Although these young people were naive, it didn't mean that they would forget the basic rules of daily training. There was no room for any negligence on the battlefield. What happened, Johnson? Freya asked as she put her hand on the hilt of her sword. I'm sorry, big sister, I was caught. Shernan parted to both sides with a swooshing sound, and two people walked out from behind. The first one was a pale young man with his hands raised high with a sad face. And a lich followed closely behind, pointing at the back of the young man's head with its fingertips, while looking at the others with the flickering green flames in its eye sockets. Hee, I caught a group of little mice. Everyone was stunned. Johnson. How could you? Then there was a sound of disbelief. Note, unyielding, the first awakened ability is called the bloodline ability. It's not something every character has, or rather, the protagonist doesn't realize it. There are two main abilities of unyielding. First, stubbornness. It ignores all physical attacks during the duration, unless the person is beheaded or the heart is damaged. Also, willpower is increased to 10 ounces. This will cause the creature to be able to stay awake for 5 minutes after being fatally injured, even if it stops breathing. Second, self-healing. It strengthens the body's self-recovery ability, but this ability only works after the injury is stable. The bloodline ability will gradually strengthen as the character gets stronger, thus showing more characteristics. P.S. Looks like the dream of the third update will be shattered again. Also, I noticed that many brothers don't read the notifications, because the effect of the noon update isn't good, so the normal update will be at 12 a.m. and 6 p.m. Chapter 19. Johnson. How could you? The young militiamen glared at their companions. The young man who was controlled by the lich's hand was pale and trembling. Shame and fear made him lower his head. But he didn't want to die, right? Freya felt that her heart was about to stop. She subconsciously pulled out her sword. But the lich immediately dispelled her thoughts. The green light in its eye socket suddenly flourished, and one of the young man's arms immediately burst like a balloon. Blood splattered everywhere, and the young man screamed miserably. His whole body fell to the ground and curled into a ball. Ah, big sister, I beg you to save me. Johnson rolled on the ground like a bloody man, wailing in pain. This frightening scene made several people turn around and vomit immediately. The ponytailed girl's face also turned pale. She swayed and almost fell down. "Human girl, you better not act rashly," the Lich warned her with a sharp voice. Its cold eyes swept across everyone present. But it immediately realized that the people present were just militiamen, not worth mentioning. Insects. The green light in the Lich's eye sockets dimmed, and it was somewhat disappointed. It was ordered to hunt down the whereabouts of the human scout that had escaped earlier, and not to get tangled up with these insects. Freya's mind was blank, but she resisted the waves of dizziness and tried to think of a way to get out of the situation. She still remembered that she was the leader of this group, so she couldn't show her weak side. As for the girl beside Roman, she had already fainted. Fortunately, Romain held her. Sophie felt Roman's hand tightly grabbing her sleeve. This was a kind of reliance and trust. Previously, he also held the ponytailed girl from behind to prevent her from falling, but the latter's strength was beyond his expectations. But no matter what, he knew that she needed some comfort at this time. Otherwise, she might collapse first. As a girl who lived in a peaceful era, it was difficult for her to accept such a cruel scene. Fortunately, Erewhon was a war-torn country, and most of the young people here had this kind of awareness. "Freya," Sophie said weakly. The young girl was slightly startled and immediately woke up. She took a deep breath and calmed down with Sophie's help. Sophie could not help but nod in admiration when she saw that her fingers had become much gentler on the sword hilt. This kind of performance could be considered outstanding. Ordinary people rarely could calm down at the edge of life and death. He didn't know why he didn't seem nervous at all. It was as if his mind had become as calm as water after his transmigration and the test of life and death. But no matter what, at least it was a good thing. He continued to ask in an almost inaudible voice, "Do you still remember what I said before about preparing for the worst?" Freya was stunned for a moment and nodded slightly. "Do you still have the strength to fight?" It was an almost undetectable response. Only then did Sophie feel relieved. He rubbed the cold wind Empress ring with his thumb. The response told him that the recharge was only half complete. 3 hours was way too slow compared to the 10-minute charge in the game. But fortunately, half of the energy was enough. Even though it couldn't create a complete wind bullet, it was enough to create a strong wind. Anyway, he had already prepared for the worst. There was no possibility of it getting worse. At the same time, the Lich finally confirmed that there were no other ambushes. It didn't even look at the wailing wretch at its feet and raised its skeletal arm. "Soldiers, kill them all." The shrill and dry voice rang out, and 4 skeletal soldiers with sharp swords and black chainmail appeared from the forest. They appeared from the thin fog, and their bodies creaked as they approached Freya's group step by step. Perhaps Freya's group had thought of fighting back against these cold monsters earlier, but not now. The young people were full of confidence before, but now they were frightened by the cold-bloodedness of the enemy. Their remaining courage was gradually defeated by the aura of death, and they were powerless to resist. They could only retreat step by step until they reached a dead end. Perhaps it was because of their biological instinct to protect themselves that they hurriedly pulled out the swords at their waists. But looking at how timid they were, no one could be sure how much fighting power they had left. Only the sound of inhaling could be heard in the forest. Looking at these pale-faced youths, the Lich couldn't help but sneer from its leaky chin. The green light in its eye sockets flashed as if it was enjoying the pleasure brought by fear. Indeed, human fear was their greatest enemy. They were weak, short-lived, and easily manipulated by useless emotions. In contrast, the undead naturally overcame all these flaws. Each of them could be the best soldier, especially the low-level undead. They didn't even need to think, they only needed to obey. Compared to the well-trained militia of the human race, who acted like helpless children on the battlefield, such weak creatures shouldn't exist in this world. It couldn't help but feel a sense of disgust from the bottom of its heart. Yes, Madara will win. But at this time, the Lich heard an extra voice. I'll leave it to you. It was the voice of a young man, calm, steady, and full of confidence. The Lich felt its soul fire jump slightly, which was an ominous sign. It immediately turned its head vigilantly. Reflected in its empty vision was a shiny ring. The ring was worn on the index finger of the seriously injured militia. It had never paid attention to that guy before. What was there to pay attention to a half-dead human? Pretending to be seriously injured could deceive others, but it certainly couldn't deceive the undead. These cold-blooded monsters that crawled out of their graves could look directly at the soul fire of a living creature. Sophie's weak and dim soul fire was definitely not fake. She was a seriously injured soldier. It seemed that it was true. But the real threat came from the ring on her hand. It was a magic ring. The green flames in the Lich's eyes dimmed little by little, and it could almost smell a deadly aura gathering in the air. It recognized this smell. One of its masters taught it black magic and let it come in contact with some counterfeits. And from the aura that escaped from it, it could tell that it was at least a magic ring that reached 20 energy rank. How could an official wizard's item appear in the hands of an ordinary person? The Lich couldn't help but show a look of horror and greed. Undead soldier, give me that thing. It raised its bone staff and screamed. OSS, but Sophie raised her right hand and spat out the word with all her might. It was more like she was squeezing out the remaining air from her lungs. When the young man fell back, he couldn't help but sweat profusely. The space expanded and then suddenly contracted. When the contraction once again exploded back to its original state, the turbulent airflow let out a shrill sound that was enough to pierce people's eardrums. The wind was like a straight arrow that pierced towards the Lich and its skeleton soldiers. Even though they raised their withered arms to try and protect themselves, the turbulence passed through their empty ribs and formed an air vortex that pulled them to one side step by step. There was no damage, but the restraining effect was obvious enough. Freya! Sophie shouted. The young girl responded and pulled out her sword. A crisp metallic sound was heard, and her long ponytail danced in the wind. But what made Sophie surprised was that this inexperienced militia captain did not act rashly. She immediately turned around and reprimanded the others. Mackie, Irene. What are you waiting for, Butchie's militia? Third squad, follow me. Inspiring courage was sometimes like a signal. In a life and death situation, a sentence, a hint could make people explode with endless power. But there was a condition, and that was to be calm. One person's calmness could affect more people, just like now. Under Freya's reminder, the young militia was slightly startled, but they finally reacted. This was their best chance, and their only chance to survive. The sudden gale caused the skeleton soldiers and the Lich to retreat, and they had no time to care about anything else. This discovery made the young men regain their courage. In the clanging sound of swords being unsheathed, the tactical qualities that they had trained on a daily basis seemed to have returned to their bodies at this moment. Mackie, cover me. Despicable monsters, now it's your turn, get rid of that black magician first. That's the Lich. Petit Finus, come behind me. They began to try to counterattack. But Sophie looked at the chaotic scene with some worry. He was afraid that these guys would be impulsive and ruin the situation, so he calmly reminded them from behind, remember to stay calm, everyone. Only when you calm down can you fight. In the Amber Sword, he had seen many rookies who were exactly like these young men. Hot-bloodedness was a good thing, but they could not let it go to their heads. He had no choice but to recite the militia's battle regulations. This was something that everyone present had memorized before, but there were not many who could remember these dry and precious experiences in battle. It had to be said that Brando was an anomaly. Sophie had all the memories of the young man's last battle. As a new recruit, his performance could not have been better. Even as a veteran warrior, he had to admit that Brando was indeed a young man with exceptional talent in swordsmanship. The only pity was that he encountered the wrong battle at the wrong time. And on the other side, under Sophie's reminder, the young men calmed down. But this was not enough. Sophie knew that these guys still needed to gain a little advantage to strengthen their confidence. Otherwise, the morale that was built up in such a short period of time would easily collapse. The wind became weaker. The skeleton soldiers shook their chainmail and prepared to counterattack. They tried to regain their balance, but Sophie's voice had already instructed the Butchie militia to change their tactics. Listen up, these low-level Madara soldiers lack intelligence and move slowly. Turning around is their biggest weakness. Try to move left in the direction where they are holding their swords. There is a blind spot there, you can attack safely. Maki, you and Irene have to attack from the left and right, do you know how to cover them? Yes, attract the skeleton's attention. That's it. Sophie was half lying on a rock, staring at the situation on the battlefield while pointing out what the enemy should do next. There was a special magic in his words that made people unable to help but believe him. This was the power that people called confidence. It was steady, calm, and made people subconsciously rely on it when they were at a loss of what to do. And the Butchie militia soon got a taste of the benefits. First, under his reminder, I cut off the tibia of a skeleton soldier at the cost of a sword in his thigh. Then, his partner, Little Phoenix, rushed up and pierced the skull of the skeleton soldier with a sword. The moment the sword pierced through the skull, the cold monster fell apart with a crash. The soul fire in its eye sockets flickered and quickly dimmed. A golden light flew out from the broken bones and entered Sophie's chest not far away. Sophie was stunned. Different from the last time, this time he clearly felt that something was wrong. Experience points. He suddenly realized this. But before he had the time to verify this, he heard the young militia shouting excitedly after defeating the enemy. Oh my God, I did it. I could not believe it. He pressed on his bleeding wound and shouted, Brando, how did you know this? Sophie smiled slightly. These experiences were summed up by him and his companions in the game. Even the most insignificant of them was filled with profound lessons because all of them were precious knowledge that had been tempered through thousands of battles and deaths. Brando also learned some similar knowledge in the militia training, but in Sophie's eyes, it was too superficial, too superficial. If that knowledge could increase his combat power by 10% when he faced the skeleton soldiers, then his own should increase by 50% or even more. From the year 375 to the Second Era, Sophie's battle experience with Madara had allowed her to know the enemy's lowest-ranked skeleton soldiers, and the highest-ranked liches, bone dragons, and even vampire lords like the back of her hand. In terms of understanding of the Dark Kingdom, there were probably not many people who could compare to Erwin. After all, before the First War of the Black Rose, the relationship between Madara and the Light World was not as tense as it was later. Friction and conflicts were not as frequent. Of course, these experiences were one of the things that Sophie was most proud of in this world. Relying on his familiarity with this world, he was confident that he could continue to walk, step by step, and return to his previous heights. But now, he had to finish the work at hand. He did not know if the gust of wind caused by before had attracted other people's attention. For safety's sake, he had to finish the battle quickly. Thinking of this, his gaze fell on the Lich. This was a troublesome enemy. P.S. Some friends don't quite understand the conditions for this book to be on the list. I will explain it to everyone here. The list for this book is the weekly potential new book list. The conditions for the new book list are, the second or more published works after becoming a Chidian author, the total word count is less than 200,000 words, the book has been in the Chidian library for 30 days, and the book has been updated once every 3 days. The formula for calculating the potential value of new book list and new book list is the week's clicks *5 plus the week's recommendations *10 plus the total collection 2. The clicks will only be counted as clicks by members. It must be clicks by members who have logged in. It will only be counted once every 6 hours. Today, this book's ranking rose by 2 places to the 22nd place. I hope to advance a little more tomorrow. Finally, I will continue to make a wish to be in the top 12. Chapter 20. Lesser liches were good at 2 spells, Veil of Darkness and Decay. These 2 spells were both black magic with the element of evil. In the game, dark magic was brought to the land by the Myurnas. The Myurnas were servants of the Dark Dragon. In the chaotic era before the beginning of the First Era, they lived on the frozen plateau north of Cruz. The Myurnas were good at using necromancy and dark witchcraft. Later on, these 2 spells, as well as all offensive spells other than elemental, nature, and holy magic were collectively known as dark magic. After the Holy War, the Flame King Gretel drove these dark creatures to the cold east. It was said that no one had seen them since then. However, the Myurnas definitely existed. In the Codex of Darkness, the Dark Lords who were exiled to Madara learned their dark witchcraft from these demons. However, Veil of Darkness was not really called dark magic because it was a support-type concealment spell. This spell happened to be able to cover the tracks of a small group of skeleton soldiers. Of course, it did not mean that they would completely disappear. One could imagine a camouflage spell that blended into a dark background. Yes, it did not cover sounds, smells, or anything other than vision, and it was limited to a certain distance. However, in the dark, this spell became the best cover for Madara's undead army. This was also the main reason why Madara's undead army often chose to move at night. As for Decay, Freya and the others had already seen this terrifying dark magic from Jonathan. This was a vicious attack spell, and also the main attack method of liches. It relied on negative energy to corrode the enemy. The more negative the enemy's emotions were, the weaker their willpower was, and the more damage they would receive from the spell. Until death. This spell was similar to the majority of black magic. It amplified negative energy in order to materialize destructive power. Possessing mysterious dark magic and commanding skeleton soldiers who did not have the ability to think, they were stronger and had a cunning nature. It seemed that liches were an enemy that was difficult to defeat. However, Sophie knew another secret. Liches did not have the ability to cast spells. Their true power came from the bone staff in their hands. It was a powerful magic item that belonged to every liches. Once it left their hands, it would turn back into an ordinary staff. Knowing this, it was easy to understand how the tactics around it should be carried out. As another skeleton soldier fell, under Sophie's reminder, Freya and Irene, the strongest swordswoman in the militia, surrounded the lich who was preparing a spell. Attack its hand. Black witchcraft isn't as mysterious as you think it is. Sophie pointed out the weakness of the undead monster. Do you see its hand gesture? Stop it from completing its spell and take its bone staff. The lich suddenly raised its head and looked at Sophie. A ball of phosphorescent green flames flickered with resentment. Sophie choked and felt her throat go dry. She knew that the zombie had its eyes on her. But she quickly calmed down. It was impossible for the zombie to bypass the militia and attack her. But being stared at by a lifeless, cold monster was not a comfortable thing. Sophie had to stop and wait for Freya and Irene's attacks to take effect. The lich smiled eerily and shook its bone staff. The darkness around it swayed like ripples and drowned it. When Irene's long sword pierced through the air, it only pierced through the air. The undead monster's original position was now empty. The young man was slightly stunned. Sophie's expression did not change. She was too familiar with the tricks of these guys. Irene, it's on your left. Irene did not react for a moment. But Freya, who caught up from behind, had already swung her sword. The sword drew a straight silver line in the dim environment. Just as it was about to reach the position that Sophie pointed out, the Lich had already staggered back. Everyone saw the shadow that was retreating like flowing water. Human, who are you? You're not a militia. A sharp voice burst out from the shadow. The Lich seemed to be flustered and exasperated. Indeed, it was impossible for a militia to know so much. Some of what Sophie said was only spread among the wizards in Madara. But Sophie did not answer, and Freya's second sword followed. The Lich's eyes flashed with green light. It raised its bone staff and pushed the girl's sword away. The Lich had 7 energy rank, and Freya's strength was probably not higher than Brando's. The ponytailed girl's attack was easily diverted to the side. She rushed forward a few steps before stopping. She immediately covered her left shoulder and frowned slightly. The arrow wound from before seemed to have split open again. Big sister, let Maki do it, your injury. Irene saw this scene and could not help but shout as she blocked the Lich's attack. Maki and Petit Finesse caught up from behind. Petit Finesse, back off. But Freya held her sword horizontally in front of the Lich and ordered sternly. But I'm also a militia. The Lich shouted indignantly. Back off, do you hear me? Petit Finesse was so angry that his neck turned red, but even so, he did not dare to disobey Freya's order. Freya had always been the leader of this group of youths. The girl was kind and had her own principles, and everyone was very respectful towards such a leader. Sophie shook her head at the back. The battlefield was not a place to argue. But the ponytailed girl's persistence made him feel good. Girls like her were rare in his world. All 4 of you, come at me together, he said from behind. Mr. Brando, you. Freya took a deep breath and could not help but look back. The young man lying on the rock, the Roman, was still standing beside him. He looked at her with an innocent expression and even winked at her. This damned girl, she defected to the enemy so quickly. She could not help but feel annoyed. The Lich is a very difficult enemy to deal with. The 4 of you can cover each other, Sophie answered seriously. But Petit Finesse, he's also a militia. Freya bit her lips and looked back. Maki and Irene were retreating under the Lich's attacks. If the undead monster found a chance to cast spells, this group would lose even more members. That was not something she could afford to lose. Thinking of this, she could only nod, all right. Hooray! Brando, you're amazing. Petit Finesse shouted and immediately unsheathed his sword. But Freya grabbed his collar from behind and ordered sternly, follow me, and don't go out of my range, do you understand? Oh. A disappointed voice. After Freya and Petit Finesse joined the battle, the situation immediately changed. She and Irene were the best swordsmen in this batch of Butchie's militia, and surprisingly, Petit Finesse was not inferior at all. In Sophie's words, this child had a strong desire to attack, and his sword was decisive and accurate. It was not like Erwin's military swordsmanship, which focused on both offense and defense, but more like Cruz's aggressive swordsmanship. But no matter how one looked at it, this was already an extremely high evaluation from a veteran warrior's point of view. Sophie thought that perhaps when Petit Finesse grew to Brando's age, his swordsmanship would not be inferior at all. Of course, his intelligence would be slightly inferior, because Brando seemed to be born for battle. He sometimes thought that if the young man in history did not die and grew up in the war, his achievements would not be any less than Freya's. But the world was unpredictable, and there were no ifs in history. Of course, the most important thing in this battle was the young man's reminder. Sophie seemed to be able to see through the Lich's thoughts, and as long as it had the slightest intention, he would be able to point it out. What was it trying to do? Why was it doing this? Was it preparing a spell? When did it need to be disturbed? The lich became more and more frightened as it fought. The undead spirit could not feel fear, but it would still be at a loss. In the end, it screamed, "Who are you, a necromancer? Or a black knight?" This sentence was met with a merciless strike from Freya's sword, and the monster's claw that was gripping the bone staff was sent flying. The monster screamed in pain, and the green flames in its eye sockets dimmed. Despicable human, the battle finally ended with Mackie's sword, and the lich was already exhausted from dealing with it. After its hands and bone staff were shattered, it howled unwillingly, and looked on helplessly as the sharp blade cut into its skull. With a crack, the soul fire burst out from its body. This was the monster's counterattack before it died. But with Sophie's reminder, only Irene, who was a little slower to dodge, suffered a little burn on her right hand. On the other side, the others also killed the remaining 2 skeletons at the cost of one of them being injured. When the forest returned to its calm state, only the wind could be heard rustling through the top of the forest. Everyone could not help but stop and look at each other. Including Freya, everyone was in disbelief. They actually won, facing 4 skeleton soldiers and a terrifying lich. Mackie's sword first fell to the ground with a clang, and then it was a chain reaction for the others. Everyone could not help but hug each other, shouting and screaming, and some even cried to vent their feelings. After surviving a disaster, it really made people feel a little absent-minded. Sophie, on the other hand, calmed down. He looked up and saw 3 golden lights flying from the darkness into his chest. And no one around seemed to notice this detail, even the Roman standing beside him was no exception. Romain let out a sigh of relief. Was he the only one who could see this? Sophie could not help but feel a little strange. He looked around, and subconsciously opened his character attributes. Just like when he was still in the Amber Sword, Sophie was always the first to check the gains and losses after a battle. Lines of green numbers immediately appeared on his retina. Strength 1. 1. Dexterity 2. 0. Vitality 1. 0. Intelligence 1. 1. Will 1. 3. Wisdom 1. 0. Absolute Strength 3. 5. Elemental Attribute, Unawakened, Brando, Human Male, Level 1, Strength System, Physical, Melee, Talent, Unyielding, XP, 4, Commoner Level 1, Militia Level 2, 6/10, HP, Weak, Near Death 10%, Bandaged, Recovers 1 HP per day. Profession, Idle Skill, 1 XP, Commoner, Basic Knowledge, Level 1, Geographical Knowledge, Level 0, Local Knowledge, Level 1, Militia, Military Swordsmanship, Level 1, Fighting Skills, Level 1, Tactical Theory, Level 0, Military Organization, Level 0. The attributes that changed were Strength and Vitality, which meant that his physical fitness had improved from the militia training, leveling up. His absolute strength increased by 2.5 ounces, mainly from the Ring of the Wind Empress 1 dexterity increase, and the change in his physical fitness was secondary. In the end, he only obtained a total of 4 EXP from the 4 skeleton soldiers and the lich. It was only half of the XP he deserved. Sophie thought for a moment, and finally came to a conclusion: the party penalty. This was simply ridiculous. How could there be such a thing in the real world? But as a gaming nerd, he did not have any professional knowledge to explain all of this. After all, compared to this, transmigration itself was a more ridiculous thing. Wasn't it? At first, he wanted to know how the party penalty was calculated, but he soon realized that it was futile because it had nothing to do with the game. Lord Martha, thank goodness I'm a little thick-headed. He could not help but touch his forehead as he had a headache. But then Sophie looked at his militia level and hesitated for a moment. To be honest, he did not want to continue investing XP in this class. The militia was so useless that it did not need to be described with words, so much so that it was always called an NPC class. In his previous life, he never thought that there would be a day where he would waste XP on this class. And he even chose the talent, Unyielding. Martha above, there were too many talents that were suitable for a warrior, and Unyielding happened to be the worst one. This skill could allow him to survive a fatal physical attack, but he only had 5 minutes to make arrangements, unless he received a strong enough healing before then. But until now, he had not seen an item that was stronger than the bandage that could restore HP. After all, these things were everywhere in the game. But Sophie did not regret it too much. In any case, this skill saved his life. But the current situation was the same. The reality was that he could not find a way to switch to another class. And he urgently needed power, so the only way left was to walk the path of the militia to the end. Sophie could not help but feel a little depressed for a moment. Was he going to change from a veteran warrior to a veteran militia? Hey, aren't warriors enough cannon fodder? P.S. Thank you to the 3 friends Peep Through the Galaxy, 285260808, and Marshall Xinglong for their long comments. Also, thank you to 285260808 for providing the reader group. Let me advertise, Amber Sword Golan, 127759266. Made a map, not sure if it looks good, come to the group if you want to see it clearly. CPW, 34H, 41A, LU, http://file2. Chidian. Com chapters 2010-1212656342716948175006806800657. JPG. Chapter 21. Sophie stared at his stats for a while, but in the end, he didn't make a decision. It was better to take one step at a time. After all, it wasn't time yet. However, because he had leveled up once, he had to use the 10 skill points immediately. After all, in a dangerous environment, every bit of extra strength counted. Of course, it seemed like it was a good idea to use it to learn swordsmanship or to learn fighting skills. If it was an ordinary person here, they would definitely choose to do so. However, Sophie hesitated for a while and thought of something else. Thus, he let the data fade from his retina and raised his head to look at the others. He found that these young militiamen were still immersed in the excitement from before. He was slightly startled, and then his face showed a serious expression. This wasn't a good sign. He motioned for Roman to help him up a little, and then raised his voice and asked, "I say, do you think you're safe?" His voice wasn't loud, but it made everyone present stop. Suddenly, it became so quiet that a pin drop could be heard. Sophie's influence was still there, and these young militiamen hadn't forgotten who had led them to victory. Speaking of which, wasn't this young man's alarmist words now becoming reality? Only then did they suddenly realize that now was indeed not the time to celebrate. It was a strange feeling to be on someone's chopping block and still dance with joy. Thus, everyone stopped at the same time and looked at him. Sophie was very weak, but he had a temperament that could lead them to victory. Everyone thought so, even Freya sighed softly. This was supposed to be her responsibility, but she couldn't control her emotions like her teammates and forgot her responsibility as a captain. Thinking of this, the girl with a long ponytail couldn't help but show a look of self-blame. Bandage your wounds, clean up the battlefield, think about what you learned during training. You don't need me to remind you, right? Sophie also sighed. These hotheads were really more inexperienced than novices. Fortunately, their physical fitness was much better than ordinary NPCs. Of course, that was only compared to NPCs. Compared to players, they were nothing. Hero template was hero template. Thinking about the initial stats and growth, forget it, it was better not to think about it. Sophie couldn't help rubbing her forehead. Under his reminder, the young militia of Butchie started to move. Indeed, the injured needed to be stopped and cleaned, and the swords and armors of the skeletons could be recovered. Especially the chainmail, it was much better than their leather armor. Others extinguished the bonfire under Sophie's instructions. Roland did not know whether to laugh or cry. Lighting a bonfire behind the enemy, he really did not know what these guys were thinking. Freya wanted to see if there was anything she could do to help. After all, Sophie was not familiar with them. However, the girl with a long ponytail soon discovered that there was no need for that. No matter how she looked at it, the young man named Brando was much more considerate than her. She couldn't help but fiddle with her long ponytail. She had some doubts in her heart. They were both militia, how could Braggs and Butchie be so different? Freya had never thought that the people in the city could be stronger than them, but now in front of Sophie, she couldn't help but feel discouraged. How could it be like this? In comparison, the Roman lady did not have so many worries. She had already happily gone with the others to organize the spoils of war. It seemed like this future merchant girl was interested in this. Sophie noticed that the little rascal called Petit Finus ran to the unconscious Johnson. He raised his head and asked everyone, "What about Johnson?" This question startled everyone. For a moment, a strange silence spread among the people. Indeed, they were all from the same village and were familiar with each other. They could be said to be good friends. Johnson was the most cowardly among them, but they did not expect him to do such a thing. Although they were forced to do so, this betrayal still hurt them. It was like a crack in the pure world, and the distrust between people was born like this. Even Freya did not know how to deal with this lack of trust between people. She wanted to protect every one of her companions, but Johnson not only hurt others, but also deeply hurt himself. Even if the ponytailed girl wanted to speak up, she was not confident that she could convince the others. Once she spoke, the harmonious relationship between friends would no longer exist. Everyone had the same thought. After all, they were just simple young people. Weakness and uprightness existed at the same time. They hesitated and subconsciously looked at the only outsider present. Sophie. Our protagonist could not help but sigh. "Miss Freya?" he asked Freya. I don't know." "Then bandage him. We don't even know if it can stop the bleeding. He might die before sunrise." Sophie sighed. He was curious why he could be so calm. Wasn't it the first time he saw a dead person? Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. This was Sophie's order, and they only needed to carry it out. This was a form of escape, but sometimes people rely on escape. On the other side, Sophie waved at Freya, gesturing for her to come over. The ponytailed girl was slightly startled and looked at her strangely. "You know first aid, right, Miss Freya?" Sophie asked. "Just call me Freya," Freya nodded. "I learned a little from Captain Martin." "Captain Martin? F***CK, so that old guy even teaches first aid." Sophie almost choked on her own saliva. In the game, the first NPC to teach first aid in the Grimoires region was Dr. Borg from Fortress Reden. That guy would give you a quest to collect 50 bundles of flax. It was so infuriating that many people skipped over to Braggs, where they only needed to pay 10 silver coins to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Although the market price of 50 bundles of flax was not much different from 10 silver coins, the process was much more troublesome. This was a secret that had yet to be discovered. Sophie was excited, but before he could rejoice, he suddenly remembered that he could not go back. What was there to think about? He was immediately disappointed and could not help but become dispirited. "Can you tell me more?" Freya took a deep breath and could not help but grit her teeth. She looked at him. "Damn it, Didn't this guy say that her skills were bad? Fortunately, the girl was not a vengeful person. She thought for a moment and asked, "What do you want to know? Techniques and key points." The ponytailed girl did not answer immediately, but came to his side to check on the girl who had fainted. Previously, Roman had excitedly run off to sort out the spoils of war, leaving her here. Fortunately, she was just agitated. She looked back at the young man who did not look too good and hesitated. "Let me take a look at your injuries." "No need, I know my own injuries." "You." "Okay, what did you learn?" Sophie avoided the topic. "It's mainly bandaging and bleeding stopping techniques, as well as cleaning wounds." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. It was like a telepathic connection. It was not a voice, nor was it a text, but he clearly felt a message. "Freya wants to teach you battlefield first aid. It requires 8 EXP to upgrade to level 0. Do you want to learn?" He let out a long sigh. This is it. It was exactly the same as in the game. Of course, he had to learn. He did not expect it to be battlefield first aid. This was really a pleasant surprise. Battlefield first aid mainly focused on stopping bleeding and preventing wound infection. It ignored environmental factors and increased the success rate by quite a lot, which was what Sophie urgently needed. He remembered that in the game, only the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire knew battlefield first aid, and players from the Theology faction were the easiest to learn this skill. As for other players, they had to farm reputation. But it was a big discovery that Martin knew this. As he thought about it, he agreed to the request in his heart. But immediately another message came in: "I didn't find a suitable profession for battlefield first aid." "Which profession would you like to place it under?" This was not important, but Sophie still placed it under the profession of militia. Although battlefield first aid was a non-profession skill for both militia and civilians, which meant that it would require double the EXP to level up. Militia as a profession could level up, but civilians as a basic identity could not. It was important to know that the level of the skill could not exceed the profession itself. Freya carefully explained the main points of the bandaging technique, but the heroic girl quickly found that the young man lying on the ground was staring at her blankly, as if he did not respond to her words at all. She was stunned for a moment, and immediately felt a surge of anger rising from the bottom of her heart. "This guy, is he looking for an excuse to take advantage of me?" The girl clenched her fists, so angry that her long ponytail trembled. "This bastard, how can you be like this? How can you face the Roman? That girl clearly has her heart set on you." Freya tried her best to control herself and waved her hand in front of Sophie's face, but there was no response. If it wasn't for the fact that he was injured, she would have kicked him. But at that moment, Sophie's eyes moved, and clarity returned to his eyes. He sorted out his skills and felt a little satisfied. With first aid, at least he had a guarantee of endurance in the upcoming battle. A party's recovery ability was an important criterion for a party's survival. Experienced players in the game would not overlook this, and Sophie was no exception. This was the reason why he gave up on sword fighting and chose first aid. But when he raised his head, he saw Freya looking at him with dissatisfaction. "What's wrong?" He could not help but be stunned. "Are you listening?" The girl gritted her teeth and asked. "Of course, I've already learned it," Sophie answered matter-of-factly. Freya almost choked on her words. "I haven't even finished, and you already know it." She looked at him with a gaze of serious distrust. "Of course." Freya choked. Just as she was about to retort, someone shouted, "Boss, we can't stop Jonathan's bleeding. Come and take a look." The ponytailed girl turned around instinctively, and saw Sophie behind her saying, just in time, "Do you want me to give it a try?" "You?" Freya's face was filled with serious suspicion. "Help me over." Don't try to be brave. Then I'll ask Miss Roman to help you." Dream on. I won't let her get close to you again, you shameless bastard. Freya gritted her teeth, but she still went over to help Sophie up. What shameless? Sophie was stunned. Why did she suddenly have another title? You know it yourself. Ha. P.S. It's a new week, so the results are very important to this book. Everyone who has votes, please vote here. Thank you. Also, please continue to look for good comments. I'll compile the good ones and put them in related posts. Chapter 22. The light in the temporary hall flickered between bright and dark. The candlelight had been deliberately reduced, and the dim light left deep marks on the texture of the wood. The remote corner was quiet, and the air was filled with an eerie atmosphere. Everyone present wasn't used to the bright firelight, but as long as the pale-faced middle-aged man with an eye patch didn't open his mouth, the rest of the people didn't dare to act rashly. If Sophie was here, she might be able to recognize this person, because his appearance had not changed much after more than 10 years. This was the deputy of the Black Lord in Sursta, the vampire baron, One-Eyed Tarkus. He was a member of the Manline family, the 14th generation vampire, and also the younger generation. But compared to his experience in the Madara army, he was far more experienced than the young in Sursta. But it did not matter, this was just the beginning of their cooperation. Tarkus looked at the skeleton soldiers taking out stacks of information from the library. He paused for a moment, turned his head, and asked the lich beside him, "Tell me, what did Rothko leave you here to report?" "Honorable General Tarkus, my master found a scout in the manor." The lich lowered his head and replied with a dry voice. "So?" He glanced at it, and his gaze returned to the tactical map spread out. "He escaped." There were a few disdainful sneers around. The vampire general raised his head, and the soft voices immediately subsided. He paused for a moment, and then said, "I know, Rothko did a good job. But I hope it will be better, so that he will not be distracted by these trivial matters. I want to see him arrive at the Belder Forest before noon." The lich nodded respectfully and left. But as soon as it left, there was a discordant voice in the meeting room. This time, the one who spoke was a tall skeleton. Its whole body was covered in an old brass armor. Dark yellow flames flickered in its eye sockets, revealing a kind of anger. "Lord Tarkus, maybe the humans have discovered our intentions, that scout." It opened its mouth, but suddenly no sound came out from its leaky jaw. This was because it saw Tarkus staring at it with its remaining eye. This gaze made it subconsciously shut up. A burst of low laughter came from the surroundings, and the sarcasm in it made the flames in its eyes flicker in annoyance. "Cabius. Here." The tall skeleton immediately replied with its chest puffed out. "You go and take down this place." Tarkus pointed at a village on the map. Before sunrise, he pointed at the roof again. "I want to see the results." "Yes, Lord Tarkus." "Wisa, Ebden." "Here." They answered in unison. "All of you, attack Verbin and seal off the River of Daggers." "Yes, Lord Tarkus." "Jinx." "Here. I'll give you 2 squads. Search and clear this area." "Yes." Tarkus raised his head and coldly swept his gaze over everyone. "You are all nobles of the darkness. We want to see you execute my every order gracefully and swiftly, meticulously. Fortress Reden is our next target." He took the lead and stood up. He placed his pale hand on his left shoulder and chanted, "Madara will be victorious." All the undead stood up and replied in a low voice, "Madara will be victorious." Tarkus lowered his head and looked at the map again. He first saw the red pine forest in the south of Buchi, then moved up to Green Village, Belder Forest, and then Fortress Reden. Human scouts. He smiled coldly. At the same time, the full moon shone on top of the pine forest. There were no wolves howling in the mountains of Yusong, but there was a wind in the black pine forest. The cold wind was like smoke that passed through the branches of the trees. It was so cold that people could not help but feel a chill down their spine. The youths of Buchi had never spent the night outside. The fog in the forest made them a little suspicious, as if every shadow was a terrifying monster. But a voice calmed them down. Press down on this spot. Yes, that's right. Water, give me a bandage. Press it down. It was finally done. Sophie wiped the sweat off his forehead and let out a long sigh. He saw a light green +2 appear on the youth's body. Only then did he feel relieved. After his first aid skill reached beginner, level 0, the healing effect of the bandage naturally increased. There was no difference between this and the game, but every part that matched Sophie's memories made him feel more at ease. How to clean the wound, prevent infection, stop bleeding, bandage, and what details to pay attention to. He guided Maki and Niberto to complete all of this. Of course, he did not have the stamina to do it himself. His body was weak, but only slightly better than the unconscious Jonas. When Niberto completed the last step under his instructions, Sophie looked up and realized that everyone was staring at her with their mouths agape. Professional. This was the only comment they had in their hearts. Petit Finus even turned his head and said to Freya in a serious tone, "Big sister, compared to your skills, it seems that your skills are inferior." As for Freya, she stood on the side of the crowd with a calm face. Sure enough, he was just looking for an excuse to get close to her. Shameless. She could not help but conclude in her heart. She looked at the Roman with some concern, only to see him counting the spoils on the ground with a smug look on his face. This damned girl. However, only Sophie himself knew that all his knowledge came from the skill, battlefield first aid. It was only when he recalled the skill in the list that all the knowledge appeared in his mind. And in the young man's memory, most of the beginner first aid knowledge came from the first 3 sections of the book, Gerson's Holy Cross, which mainly talked about bandaging skills. Sophie happened to know Gerson in the game, the current high priest of Brags. The content of the book was as if he had seen it himself, as if he had studied it hundreds of times. The feeling of being at ease was like learning first aid skills with a plugin. Unfortunately, there was a price to pay for using a plugin. On the other hand, Sophie quickly understood that in fact, there were a total of 10 members in Butchie's 3rd militia team. Including Freya, there was Maki, Irene, Ike, and Petit Finus, who he was familiar with. Then there was Niberto and Vlad, who did not like to talk much. The 2 brothers' families were mountain people who migrated from the Bora region. They inherited the quiet nature of the locals and loved to do more than talk. Then there was Jonas, but the latter was unconscious and the chances of waking up were not high. Then there was the dreamy merchant girl, and the girl who was with her. Sophie later found out that the girl was the town's baker's daughter, but she was shy and introverted, unlike the other 2 ladies who were generous. The girl was called Bertha. She had a gentle personality, but at least she was a good girl with a kind heart. These were all the people Sophie had to deal with. They seemed to be very outstanding young people, but Sophie knew that they were a bunch of newbies who did not understand what they were going to face. Thus, he thought for a while and asked, "Do you have any plans?" In the next moment, the smiles on their faces disappeared, and it was replaced by silence. "Let's go to Fortress Reden." After a while, Irene suggested. "That's right, Captain Martin and the rest will definitely go there." Ike agreed. As expected, Sophie shook his head. He raised his head to look at the youths, and saw that they were silent, uneasy, and at a loss for what to do tomorrow. Even though Freya seemed to be in a better state, her grip on her sword was so tight that her knuckles turned white, betraying her true feelings. Only Roman answered naturally, "I'll go with Brando." Sophie was both annoyed and amused at the same time. However, the merchant girl's straightforwardness left a good impression. The young man paused and said, "All right, I agree with you on one point. The most important thing for us now is to leave this place." "That means there's something you don't agree with, right?" Freya asked. Sophie nodded. "Does anyone have a map?" Everyone looked at each other. Who would have such a thing? Although they were militia, most of the time, they were under the command of the local guards. To put it bluntly, they were just a reserve team. Sophie also realized his slip of the tongue. In Erewhon, without the permission of the Holy Cathedral, he would be treated as a spy if he carried a map. He always thought of himself as a traveler, and forgot that he was already a member of this world. And here, there were no more players. The guards seemed to have one. Mackie stammered from the back of the crowd. Sophie shook his head, and thought to himself, "Isn't that nonsense?" He sighed and turned to the merchant girl. "Roman, give me a sword." "All right, Brando." Sophie took the sword and drew 2 lines on the soft ground. "This is the Waisha River, and this is the Yusong River." He used the tip of the sword to point a few times between the 2 rivers. "This is Butchie, this is Green Village, and this is Weibin." He only used a few simple strokes to draw a rough outline, but it opened the eyes of the young people once again. After all, in this era, there were not many people who understood the world as well as he did. "Isn't that the 3 towns?" Bertha couldn't help but cover her mouth. "That's amazing, so this is what we look like here." Ike looked at Sophie with admiration. "So Butchie is here." "Brando, how did you know?" everyone asked at once. After all, they were young people, and they couldn't suppress their curiosity. Sophie shook his head. What a joke, he didn't even recognize the 3 towns novice village, then he might as well find a piece of tofu and kill himself. Of course, he couldn't answer like that, so he purposely asked, "Haven't you learned about tactical maps?" Tactical maps. What's that? Everyone was at a loss. Mother Marcia above, could it be that even the militia of Brugloss had to learn this? Everyone couldn't help but admire him blindly. But our main character laughed in his heart. Even the lower-ranking officers in the regular army wouldn't know about it, so it would be strange if the militia learned it. Of course, he wouldn't expose himself in front of everyone, but he pointed at the intersection of the 2 rivers. "This is Fortress Reden." "Ah, this is Fortress Reden?" the Roman asked curiously. "What's wrong?" Sophie could clearly hear the stifled laughter around him, and he couldn't help but raise his head to ask. "It's like this, Brother Brando. When the Roman was young, she was very envious of the merchants in Fortress Reden, and wanted to be a merchant every day. Once, she ran out and said that she wanted to do a big business in Fortress Reden, but in the end, Petit Finus not only betrayed the country, but also kept them guessing. The people around couldn't help but laugh. In the end, Sophie asked. She got lost in the forest halfway, and it was Uncle Seal who found her. Petit Finus laughed. No, no such thing. Roman's eyebrows were raised. Sophie looked at the future merchant lady, and couldn't help but think that she didn't learn her lesson. All right, let's get back to the topic. Why do you want to go to Fortress Reden? He calmed himself down and continued to ask. There's an army there. Captain Maiden and the others will definitely go there. My uncle too. Everyone started to talk at once, but they all had the same idea. They all had their own family, and although they were separated, they might go to Fortress Reden, so why not go there? Sophie couldn't refute this answer, but it was normal. Who would leave their family behind? But he also knew that those who escaped from Butchie would most likely be caught by Madara's army. And if they went to Fortress Reden now, they would only be walking into a trap. Sophie was very clear that they had to advance parallel to Death God, Cabias, and avoid it by entering Belda Forest. They had to cross the River of Daggers before Ebden and Weezer could surround them. From there, they would enter the hunting deer forest, and pass by Insursta's main force to Anzac, where they would inform the local garrison about the Gusta tribe's plan. This was the only way for them to survive, and Erwin wouldn't lose as badly as he did in history. But how should he say it? Forget it, let's just follow the old rules and take one step at a time. He rubbed his heavy forehead and changed his words. All right, we can go to Fortress Reden first, and decide what to do next based on the situation. He raised his head and saw Freya's worried expression. The girl obviously didn't believe him. Mr. Brando. It's nothing, just a guess. Maybe the situation will change. He smiled at the girl. But even though he said that, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Reality was cruel, and it wasn't up to him to make a choice. Of course, if there was a chance, he would definitely try again. Otaku, you're so naive. He couldn't help but laugh at himself. P.S. My grades never went up, sigh. Chapter 23. Both sides spent the night in a state of urgency. Tarkus was waiting for the attack plan to unfold bit by bit, while Brando was worried that he would not be able to grasp the time. Madara's army and Butchie's 11 youths were walking side by side in the silent darkness, their fates alienated yet closely linked. But the sun would eventually rise day after day. The first ray of light seemed to have just passed through the hair, but the morning passed in a flash. Half of the day was peaceful, and they did not even encounter the most common brown bear in this area. But after summer, the brown bear in the wild also became a gentle animal. It was noon. Hearing the sound of the bushes in front of him, Brando could not help but squint his eyes. The sunlight shone through the new green leaves, showing a beautiful fragmented gold between the gaps. He followed the sound and looked up from the simple stretcher, like a mirror, a shining reflection reflected in his eyes. It was a lake. Like an emerald gem embedded in the mountains and forests, the ripples created a pool of sparkling light. Look, it's a lake. Petit Finis shouted in surprise. Freya immediately rewarded him with a knock on the head, making the youth cry out in pain. It was not a good time to travel, and now it was better for everyone to be cautious, because no one knew if they would encounter Madara's army nearby. Although the night was peaceful, Brando said that it was because this area had no strategic value. As for what the strategic value was, the girl did not know. The young man from Bragg's always seemed to know more than everyone else. Although she was somewhat unwilling, she could only admit it. She did not know if every youth in the city was as good as him. Under the subtle influence, Freya's perception had completed a transition from one extreme to another. She could not help but be a little jealous. If she also came from Braggs's militia training camp, she would have learned better than that shameless guy. It was really unfair. But only God knew, there was no such thing as Braggs's militia training camp. Sophie, no, it should be Brando. His militia training was done in Drager. Of course, he would never expose this trick at this time. He needed to maintain some prestige so that these young people would believe that a team without a leader would not be able to get out of this predicament. Freya might be able to take up this position in the future, but not now. Thinking up to this point, Brando couldn't help but glance at the other party. The girl with the long ponytail was considering her surroundings. She hesitated for a moment before she relaxed her grip on her sword and let out a sigh. Let's rest here. Freya ordered after confirming that there was no danger. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief. We're going to die. I bet that when we reach Fortress Reden, I'll just lie down and sleep. We'll see when we get there. Irene, shut your mouth. At the edge of the forest, the sound of young people talking could be heard. Although they deliberately kept their voices low, their words were still filled with a sense of happiness. Everyone was too tired. The night wasn't too long, but it was torture for his tense nerves. Normal people would not be able to imagine the pressure of life and death. The group of people walked through the forest under the dim starlight. They were surrounded by darkness where they could not even see their own fingers. Only the nocturnal sounds of insects flapping their wings could be heard, and the screeching of owls could be heard from afar. In the darkness, the rustling sound seemed to pass through one shrub after another. Coincidentally, silence surrounded everyone, as if a silent ghost had seized everyone's heart. The gloomy and cold atmosphere could not help but make people's nerves tense. Behind the dense foliage was always an unknown. Have you ever heard of the mountain monsters described in bedtime stories? At sunrise, the cold dew slowly dissipated. The young people looked like they were fished out of the water. Their faces were pale, and their wet hair stuck to their foreheads. Even Brando was not an exception. He used to sleep in his own bed, away from all the conflicts. He did not lie on a stretcher, listening to all the strange sounds around him. Especially in the unknown darkness, there would be grass that reached your waist brushing past your face. You did not know what kind of insects were crawling around your neck. It was creepy. Marcia above, when he thought about how he would probably have to live like this for more than a week, he was a little crazy. He now missed his past life very much. Even if it was a little useless, he still wanted to return to a stable life. Otakus were always full of confidence when making a promise, but the passion came and went quickly. But when he saw the tired and worried expression on Freya's face, his heart calmed down. Because he was trusted. He suddenly realized that he had to abandon the identity of Sophie and try to accept a new life. He could not help but touch his chest. The one who died was not Brando, but Sophie. It was not that he accepted this world, but this world accepted him. Brando's stretcher was placed by the lake. Not far away, he could see the colorful pebbles. He first checked Jonathan's condition. The latter miraculously survived, but his physical condition was not good. How is he? Mackie could not help but ask. It's hard to say. Sophie, no, he should be called Brando now. He shook his head. Mackie was silent and stared at the lake in a daze. This lake was called Lake Che. They came here, which meant that they were close enough to the green village. But among all the people present, only Brando knew the correct direction. The young man looked in one direction. In that direction, there were a few faint traces of gray smoke in the sky. It seemed that Cabias had already attacked the village. Its fate was not far from Butchie's. Madara's army attacked quickly, just like he remembered in the game. In fact, Brando still remembered this lake. He raised his head and looked at the other side of the lake. In that direction, the trees were lush, and under the dark mountains, he could no longer see the familiar figures of the past. He remembered that he had leveled up in this area for a long time, with brown bears and foxes. Thinking of the days when he sold leather to make money in the game, Brando could not help but smile. He removed his hand from Jonathan's forehead and said to Mackie, "Do me a favor." "What is it?" "Help me take off the bandage." Brando wanted to change the bandage, but before that, he wanted to let the Roman distribute the roll of sausages he took from his house. He wanted everyone to have a taste of the black sausages from the Grimoires region. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. These young people did not even think of preparing food before they escaped from Butchie. Even Freya, who looked so calm and steady, did not think of this possibility. That was why they only had one roll of sausages left. "Why don't you tell me what you saw on the day you left Butchie, and learn more about the enemy?" "Ouch, Mackie, be gentler." His eyebrows twitched as he gasped in pain. Freya saw this scene and could not help but sigh. "Let me do it, move aside, Mackie." The young man was stunned, and the girl with the long ponytail had already walked in front of him. "Is it okay to distribute the food like this?" She lowered her head and carefully removed the bandage for Brando. She hesitated for a moment before asking in a small voice. "What problem?" This guy, he knows what I'm talking about. Freya could not help but grit her teeth, but what made Brando laugh was that even so, this kind girl did not dare to do anything with her hands. You know what I'm talking about, we can't go to Fortress Reden, right? Freya's voice was even lower, almost inaudible. Brando could not help but look at this girl again. Of course he felt that her light brown ponytail suited her temperament very well. He thought for a moment and asked, "Your aunt and uncle should be in the group, right?" Freya lowered her head, and her hand that was removing the bandage stopped for a moment. "I'm sorry," Brando sighed, "if there's a chance, I'll try my best. But I can't guarantee anything, I can't take on such a big responsibility." "Thank you." An almost undetectable answer. "Big sister Freya, big brother Brando, what are you whispering about?" Petit Finus's untimely voice sounded at this time. He was sitting under a beech tree, curiously looking at the two of them. If Big Sister Freya was someone he had always admired, then Brando was this young man's new idol. His words successfully attracted everyone's attention, and everyone's eyes turned to him at the same time. Freya's face suddenly turned red. Only then did she realize that she was too close to that guy. She quickly took a step back and explained, "No, nothing, we're just discussing." Unfortunately, this innocent girl did not understand that it was better if she did not explain, but her explanation made it seem like she was trying to cover something up. Especially her flushed face. When had the captain ever been so shy? Roman rubbed her sleepy eyes and sat up from the ground. She seemed to have just figured out what had happened. Even though Freya was afraid that she would misunderstand and kept trying to signal her with her eyes, she did not expect the merchant girl to smile nonchalantly as if she was thinking wrongly. "It's all right, Freya." "Roman, the ponytailed girl did not say anything, and instead her face turned red. She glared at Roman, almost wanting to strangle this girl to death. Brando noticed that there was a worried look in the crowd. It was the young man named Noberto. He was slightly startled. Could it be that he was interested in Freya? But he could not lack courage, he could not help but shake his head. "That's enough," he interrupted, "I'm discussing the food distribution with your captain." When Brando opened his mouth, it was as if he had a natural prestige, making everyone stop and involuntarily turn their attention to him. "But Roman, what is the meaning of your sparkling eyes?" He thought to himself, "Are you looking at a pile of treasures?" The young man shook his head and continued, "With this amount of food, even if we save some, it's not enough for us to eat. Besides, we still need to maintain our strength to deal with the enemies we may encounter." But Freya had just said half a word when she saw Brando shake his head at her. "The Green Village is not far away, why don't we go there to find food? The undead do not need food and shelter, and those things originally belonged to us humans, so we naturally have the right to take them back." He answered. "The Green Village. Was it not attacked by Madara?" Ike sat on the ground and asked. The wound on his leg was bandaged by Brando, and it was almost healed today. The healing effect provided by the bandage was a potential recovery value, which referred to the effect that would slowly occur during the next time the bandage was changed. In the game, it took 6 minutes for the bandage to take effect, but in this world, the recovery period was extended to 1 day. Therefore, the wound would slowly heal over the course of a day until the next bandage change. Of course there are enemies, but we will move in small groups, so we may not necessarily clash with the enemy. Brando answered. He had already thought of this arrangement for the escape route, and now he had a card up his sleeve. "Small groups, does that mean we'll sneak in?" Petit Finus was immediately interested. "Yes, I'll pick a few people to go with me." Brando nodded, his eyes looking at everyone. "Ike and Vlad are injured, Mackie and Noberto stay and take care of them, Roman, you stay and take care of Bertha, as for the others, Irene and Freya, you two come with me." "No. No." Freya and Petit Finus objected together. "Irene and I can go, but Brando, you have to stay." The ponytailed girl took a deep breath. Did this guy know how serious his injury was? I want to go too. The brat was the first to jump up. Brando looked at the two of them and sighed, "All right, I'll answer your questions one by one." As he spoke, he bit the bandage in his mouth, then wrapped it around his body a few times and tightened it. A light green +2 appeared on his body. He took a deep breath and felt his strength gradually returning to his body. Although he was still very weak, especially since the corrosive poison was still eating away at his life force, at least he could move on his own. He looked up and asked, "Miss Freya, why do you want me to stay?" "Injury. It's good that you know." The ponytailed girl turned her head away. Brando smiled slightly. "That might not be the case. P.S. Screaming at the top of my lungs for recommendations, I feel like my score has been deducted. I don't know if I'm seeing things." Chapter 24. Not going to Green Village. That's impossible. Brando knew something that would have a huge impact on his future plans. Therefore, whether it was to stock up on food or to verify his hypothesis, he had to go to the village that might have been occupied by Madara. Therefore, he thought for a moment and calmly asked, "If I don't go, do you know how to start?" Infiltrating and searching is not something that can be taken for granted. It requires careful planning and investigation beforehand. Infiltrating and searching were the strengths of those who had invested a lot of training in the shadows, such as the Nightingale and the Hunter. As a warrior, Brando didn't know much about them, but after all, he had formed a team with them and gone on a mission. With this kind of memory, he was much better than these militia. Freya shook her head. It was not that she didn't understand, but Brando's injuries were too serious. "You can tell us what to do, and leave the rest to us." Brando wasn't surprised by Freya's rejection. He knew that he had to choose the persuasion method that he was good at. For example, the wisdom of a veteran warrior, Roman. "Yes. Give me your sword." He opened his hand to the side. "Here, Brando." The Roman held the sword with both hands and confidently handed it to him. "Thank you." Brando took the sword, took a deep breath, and tried to adjust his condition to the best. He was in a weakened state with less than 40% of his HP, and the decaying poison made him unable to use the other 20% of his strength. In other words, he could only use 0.6 ounces at most. It was about the same as a 14-year-old boy. "There is not much time. To prove that I have the ability to participate in this expedition, we might as well use an ancient and traditional method to decide." He pulled out the sword, the way warriors talk. Our protagonist looked around and found that everyone looked as if they had misheard him. Martha above, in this batch of butchy militia, Freya deserved to be called the #1 swordswoman. Even Irene was defeated by her. "Brother, do you really know how bad your condition is right now?" The same question popped up in their minds. "Brando, don't joke around," Freya said somewhat angrily. She was quite confident in her swordsmanship. If Brando could defeat her in this state, did he think that he was a veteran who had experienced the November War? Brando didn't say a word. He only made a "please" gesture with his sword. The ponytailed girl was so angry that she almost blacked out. She thought that there should be a limit to being reckless, but it seemed that the reality was not as she thought. She gritted her teeth and made up her mind to use reality to teach Brando a lesson. Freya straightened her sword and slashed vertically without thinking. Her basic skills were outstanding. Her sword was very steady and brought about a thin blade wind. Brando blocked with his sword, but the huge force from the sword almost dislocated his wrist. But he immediately flattened his sword and slashed down at the edge of Freya's sword. The young man's strength wasn't great, but it gave Freya a fright. Because she hadn't entered the attack range yet, the opponent's sword was almost touching her hand guard. Even though she was unwilling, the ponytailed girl could only return without any success. In fact, she wasn't at a disadvantage. Brando's move was very famous among the warriors' swordsmanship. It came from Cruz's battle formation swordsmanship. In the game, it was called Brando's reverse cut. This was a high-level combat swordsmanship. Even though Brando could only rely on this body's original swordsmanship to display it, it was more than enough to deal with an amateur swordswoman like Freya. Brando remembered that he learned this move from a mercenary after traveling thousands of miles. The price was 2 barrels of Madara's bone wine. Now it seemed that the 2 barrels of bone wine were worth it. Freya retreated. In order to deal with Brando's following attack, she gripped her sword with both hands and clenched her teeth, pushing the opponent's sword to the side. Her reaction was fast, but not smart enough. Because Brando had already retreated a step, when she reacted, the long sword in his hand was already pointed at her chest. Freya clenched her teeth and used the hilt of her sword to knock away Brando's sword. Then she chased after him with her sword. But to Brando, this sword was already out of order. It was purely because he didn't want to admit defeat. He lightly knocked, and the opponent fell to the ground because she lost her balance. Dust flew everywhere. "Looks like I've convinced you." Brando withdrew his sword and replied indifferently. Freya raised her head, her face full of disbelief. Not only her, the 9 people of Butchie's militia, other than the Roman who still took it for granted, were all dumbfounded. Was that still the militia's swordsmanship? Compared to those veterans in the regular army, wasn't it? How could it be? It's not strange. I'm Braggs's #1 swordsmanship in the 33rd batch of militia. Brando casually replied, and then you, Petit Finus, let us solve your problem. Petit Finus looked terrified and quickly shook his head. I'd better not go, you guys go. This kid. Brando couldn't help but shake his head. After agreeing with the others on the time and place to meet up, Brando, Freya, and Irene quickly set off. Time was tight, forcing them to race against time. The Green Village was about east of Lake Che, so it wasn't too far away. Especially when the 3 of them went deeper into the forest, through the dense canopy, they could see a few gray pillars of smoke in the east. The sky was getting darker and darker, and it didn't look like a good sign. According to Brando's memories and suggestions, they approached the area that Madara might occupy from the north of the village, and the facts proved that his guess was correct. The undead army had just swept through the area, leaving behind a scorched land. Looking at the burning village below, Freya's last glimmer of hope was extinguished. It seemed that Madara's army was indeed in front of them, so it would be impossible for them to reach Fortress Reden in time. She couldn't help but look at Brando, wondering what this young man was thinking. But Brando was hiding in the bushes, looking at the skeleton soldiers passing by and carefully counting the trees in front of him. He counted to the 12th tree and memorized the appearance of the tree. Green Village, south of the forest, the 12th beech tree. He remembered clearly that there was a key buried under the tree. In the game, it was an independent quest that led to a tomb in the village. He remembered who had discovered the quest. It was a priest, wasn't it? But it didn't matter because he knew that it was the tomb of a Templar knight. If everything went according to the game's development, there should be some good stuff inside. But his goal was the sword in the tomb, the Thorn of Light. It was a treasured sword infused with the power of light. At his current level, wielding it was equivalent to wielding a mini undead slaughterer. Of course, he could only imagine how powerful the legendary divine weapon would be. After confirming this, Brando turned around and pointed outside the forest. Do you see that? See what? Irene and Freya were stunned. The number of skeletons patrolling, 2 times, 4 times. Looks like there are 2 teams of Madara in the village. 22 to 24 skeleton soldiers and 2 necromancers, our protagonist replied in an experienced manner. That's a lot. Irene was shocked. Fortunately, that's not the main point. The main point is that they control the cemetery and the square. The necromancers will definitely use spirit summoning there. They will have an endless supply of reinforcements. That's what we have to be careful about. Brando continued. This is blasphemy against the dead. Freya clenched her fists in anger. Indeed, but they have the right to do so. He sighed, then pointed at the forest not far away and said, "Do you see that over there? That ranch? You can use the fences and the shadows of the bushes to sneak in. There should be a cellar under the barn. It shouldn't be hard to find, and it shouldn't have been burned down. You can hide there and wait until it's dark before we come out." The girl nodded subconsciously, but suddenly realized something was wrong. "How do you know?" "I've been here for a while." Brando answered casually. He wasn't lying. It was just that he wasn't in this world. "And then, what are we going to do?" Irene asked. "Wait for me there. I'll come to you at night." Those monsters should be focused on summoning the skeletons. They won't bother you for the time being. If you do attract attention, you have to pay attention to your breathing and heartbeat. The undead can see your life force. Brando reminded them bit by bit. "Wait, you're not with us." Freya caught on to this detail. "I have my own things to do." "You dash," she was about to say something when she saw the young man patting his sword. His meaning was, "Don't forget that I've already convinced you." But how could that be the same thing? Freya opened her mouth to refute, but Irene pulled her back and signaled her to be careful of the patrolling skeletons in Madara. "Do you trust me?" Brando asked softly. Freya shook her head, but hesitated and nodded. "That's good. Now is the time. Hurry up and go." "Don't worry, I'll come back safe and sound," he answered seriously. Freya looked at him and wanted to say something, but stopped herself. But in the end, she was pulled away by Irene. Brando watched them pass through a colorful forest and hide in the bushes below. Then they followed a fence and passed through the long meadow. Finally, they successfully sneaked into the ranch. He heaved a sigh of relief. Brando turned back and looked at the short forest below. A sense of nervousness suddenly shrouded his heart. This would be his first adventure alone in this world. Maybe it looked the same as before, but there was no failure here. There was only death. Speaking of which, he was more willing to work with Freya and the others. But how could he explain the key? He couldn't say that he buried it in the past. This kind of clumsy lie wouldn't even fool Irene, let alone the meticulous Freya. After weighing the pros and cons, he decided to work alone. "There's no difference, old man. Just treat it as cutting it down and training it again." He rubbed his forehead and couldn't help but encourage himself. P.S. It's almost 12. Can I watch it today? Chapter 25. When the two figures of Freya had completely disappeared, Brando calmed down. Unlike sneaking into the pasture from the other direction, where he could use the colorful forest as cover, from here to the undergrowth below, he had to be in the line of sight of a whole group of skeleton soldiers. Taking risks was necessary, but unnecessary risks were also unnecessary. He decided to wait for the sky to turn dark before starting his operation. Although the undead could see life energy directly, their search range was limited at night. But Brando was not idle, he was observing the patrolling pattern of the skeletons below. Soon, he found a gap in their patrolling. Around the time when the two scattered squads crossed each other, he could get a gap of 10 seconds. He looked at the terrain. From here to the undergrowth below, there was a distance of 20 meters. He had 2 OZ agility, but in the weakened state, he could not use it at full strength. To complete a 40-meter round trip and dig out the key buried under the tree in 10 seconds, this seemed to be an impossible challenge. He decided to find another way. The sky quickly darkened. It's time to move, he said to himself in his heart. His whole person blended into the dark environment, but in fact, he was so nervous that his heart was pounding. This was a game with his life. What game's death penalty could be more exciting than this? He held his breath and stared below, silently counting 14. It was exactly the time it took for the two pairs of skeletons to cross each other. Then he first threw the sword in his hand in that direction. This was the first step. 20 meters away, the sword fell on the soft leaves and made a soft sound. Brando waited for a long time in fear. When the first patrol passed by for the second time, he confirmed that everything was normal and sighed in relief. Next was the main point of the plan. Brando counted for the second time. When the two squads of skeletons crossed each other for the third time, he took a deep breath and rushed out. At that time, his mind was almost blank. He could not think, nor could he care about anything. There was only one goal, and that was speed up. 3 seconds. Brando arrived and let out a long sigh. He squatted down, dug up the fallen leaves, grabbed his sword and began to dig. But the efficiency was very slow, far beyond his expectations. He dug while counting in his heart. 1, 2, 3. 6 seconds. He gave himself an extra second, then threw away his sword and started running back. The scenery around him seemed to be moving as fast as lightning. He dived into the bushes and stopped, feeling as if his heart had stopped beating. The skeleton soldiers passed by him for the fourth time, but they did not discover his existence. Brando took a deep breath. He felt that this stimulation made his limbs go soft, but the accelerated secretion of adrenaline made him deeply excited. Then he shrank back and continued to wait for the second round. Brando was much calmer in his second attack, but this time, he returned without any success. The third time, he only dug for 2 seconds because he could clearly feel his stamina dropping. Then, for the fourth time, he finally came into contact with the cold, square-shaped object under the soil. Brando had never seen such a thing before, but at this moment, his heartbeat couldn't help but accelerate. That was it. Brando had a certain feeling in his heart. For a moment, he could not help but want to dig this thing out, but he knew that there was not enough time. He took a deep breath to calm himself down, put down his sword, and ran back. The fifth time, Brando had completely calmed down. He ran under the tree, picked up the sword and began to pry open the square stone slab. It immediately loosened, but at this moment, Brando's ears twitched. Wait, the sound was not right. The skeleton soldiers below changed their patrol route. Impossible. Our hero felt a chill in his heart. He did not know if God was playing a malicious joke on him. Madara's skeleton soldiers lacked basic intelligence. They would not change their patrol route unless there was a lich's intention. But the lich would not change its original intention for no reason. Unless there was an external invasion. Brando's past experience in the game became very clear at this moment. He could not help but look in the direction of the ranch. Could it be that Freya and Irene had been exposed? But looking down from the hillside, the direction was calm. The young man immediately dismissed this idea. The footsteps of the skeleton soldiers behind him were getting closer. The monsters should have seen him. Brando felt his blood freeze. What should he do? There were 6 skeletons below, and any one of them could kill him. Use the Ring of the Wind Empress? No, not to mention that the sound would attract trouble. With the size of the wind bullet, it was already good enough to hit 3 skeletons. What about the rest? Brando felt his scalp tingling more and more. He kept reminding himself to stay calm and think about what he usually did in the game. Yes, make use of the advantages. Every attribute point and skill in a player's hand could be used to survive in a desperate situation. As long as he used his imagination. He immediately thought of a possibility, but this crazy idea also scared him. This is not a game. Brando, can you afford to pay that price? He could not help but ask himself. But the skeleton soldiers were getting closer and closer. He had to make a choice. He took a deep breath and immediately stabbed his sword into his lower abdomen. The tearing pain came from his abdomen. The strong feeling was 10,000 times more intense than in the game. Brando groaned and almost knelt down. He felt like he was going crazy. Large beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, but at the same time, the skeleton soldier's footsteps also stopped. Success, the unyielding skill was effective. It deceived those unintelligent skeletons. Brando did not dare to be negligent. He resisted the waves of dizziness and pulled out his sword. Although he had deliberately avoided the vital parts, blood still splashed out. The young man did not dare to look. He was almost breathing hard as he used his sword to pry out the square slate. Then he turned around and slid down the hillside. He had 5 minutes to save himself. His life was hanging by a thread. The unyielding skill ignited the soul fire to support him all the way to the village. But when Brando fumbled into the village, he was shocked. Between the ruins of the buildings, there were snow-white skeletons everywhere. Those new skeletons were the Lich's masterpiece. Under the influence of the summoning spirit, they crawled out of the graveyard or tore open flesh to crawl out. Under the gradually darkening sky, these white skeletons brought a huge sense of oppression. Fortunately, Brando was experienced and knowledgeable. Otherwise, he would have been scared to death. He calmed down and counted the number of skeletons. There were more than 50 of them. This was not a small number. This meant that Madara's invasion strength was increasing with their pace. But the only thing that made him feel at ease was that Brando knew that these thin skeletons were not on the same level as their kind that had been refined by darkness. They were even slightly weaker than an ordinary adult man. Brando looked as he moved forward. His goal was the small temple in the village. It should be in the north, if his memory was not messed up. Among the many disadvantages brought by death, there was always one advantage. That was, the undead wandering on the street regarded him as one of their kind. Even if Brando bumped into these headless guys, the latter would at most adjust their balance and continue to move forward. This was a huge piece of good news. With this advantage, it only took him 3 minutes to find the Temple of Kalidas. But it seemed that the undead of Madara did not have much respect for the god of pottery in the game. They had already collapsed one of the walls of the temple. This provided a lot of convenience for Brando. He directly went along the wall and went in. It was pitch black inside. Brando remembered that the temple had been rebuilt, but after exploring it for a while, he found that the interior was not too different. He quickly found the path to the meditation room with his memory. To his surprise, there was a wandering skeleton in the meditation room. Brando jumped in fright when he saw it in the dark. Fortunately, his nerves were strong enough to withstand it. But he quickly calmed down and tried to take a deep breath to comfort himself that this was just a puppet without any intelligence. But his breathing was getting harder and harder, and his vision was starting to blur. He had about a minute left. Brando recalled that the entrance to the secret passage should be behind the podium. He groped there and found the square depression. At that moment, he really felt like Martha was on top of him. He was almost trembling as he pressed the slate into the depression, afraid that God would play a malicious joke on him again. Fortunately, it did not. In the dark silence, there was a soft click, then a second click, then a muffled rumbling sound came from the ground, and finally, with a crash, he felt a breeze behind him. Brando looked back and saw the tomb passage that led down. There was light inside, and the walls of the passage were inlaid with purple shimmering crystals. These things were not valuable, but the light was too dim, so they were not widely used. He shook his head, and the dizziness almost knocked him out. There was no such thing in the game. The player would not feel any discomfort for the first 5 minutes of the unyielding skill in the amber sword. But when the time was up, even if you were as strong as a bull, you would still fall down immediately. Brando was almost relying on his own will to hold on, and the desire to live urged him to grit his teeth and move forward. As he walked, he recalled the history of the tomb. The Templar knight who was buried here was a famous NPC called Gerald or something. He was born here and participated in Erewhon's War of Independence. He lived a righteous life, and after his death, he was buried in his hometown according to his wishes. It was said that this place used to be a forest, but later on, a shrine was built here. The people of the Holy Cathedral of Fire modified the tomb of the Templar knight so that he could rest in peace in the kingdom of God. The sword that Brando was looking for was called the Thorn of Light, and it was also the weapon that the knight used when he was alive. The young man did not intend to disturb the peace of the dead, but presumably, the knight did not want the undead to wreak havoc in his hometown. The youth started to gasp for breath. He used all his strength to support himself against the wall of the tomb for 20 to 30 meters, and the end of his vision gradually became brighter. This kind of gentle white light that lasted for a long time must be the effect of a high-grade glimmer gem. I'm close to my goal. But before he had time to breathe a sigh of relief, a black shadow suddenly fell from the ceiling. 2 steel claws clasped his shoulders and lifted him up abruptly. Brendel felt a huge force seeping into his limbs, as though there were 2 iron chains on his body, preventing him from moving. He immediately realized that this was an absolute difference in strength, and this strength was at least 4 OZ ranks higher than him. He was shocked, and his experience in the game immediately made him realize what this thing was, a gargoyle. In the past, the guy who completed the quest did not mention that there was a gargoyle in the tomb. A gargoyle was the masterpiece of a bugle wizard, and it was a level 23 monster. Compared to it, a low-level lich was like a gentle baby. Before Brando could finish his thought, he felt himself being lifted up into the air, and it was a feeling of being in the clouds. He felt himself flying for a long distance, and then his back hit the cold wall of the tomb. All the bones in his body groaned, as if they were broken one by one. But our protagonist did not have the time to worry about this. He got up and shook his head, and saw that the gargoyle was chasing after him like a ghost. Was there still a chance? P.S. Really, it's not that I don't want to explode. I'm just a few 100 points away. Chapter 26. The ferocious gargoyle was almost 2 meters tall when it stood up, and its demonic wings were more than 5 meters long even when it was half retracted. It almost occupied the entire space when it flew over, and a violent gust of wind swept across Brendel's face. Brendel's breath stopped, and he immediately found that there was no room for him to dodge. He immediately raised his right hand and shouted with all his might, "OSS." A buzzing sound. In the narrow space, the air expanded forward and let out a sharp whistle. Bang, 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 bang. 4 sounds were heard, and the shimmering crystals embedded in the wall of the tomb exploded. The whirlpool of wind hit the winged beast head-on, and the blade-like airflow hit the monster's iron surface. However, the gargoyle also bent half of its body and flew back like a kite with a broken string. In the distance, there was the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground, and smoke and dust flew in the corridor. Brando coughed in the smoke, grabbed his sword and rushed forward. His experience in the game told him that the gargoyle had 60 HP, and it was not something that could be easily killed by a wind bullet. Sure enough, he found the heavily injured gargoyle behind the smoke and dust. Half of its wing was completely shattered, and fresh blue liquid flowed out from it, forming a bright line on the ground. The monster opened its mouth and screamed at Brando, and its other claw was hanging down weakly. It seemed that it was injured. Kill it while it's injured. Brando did not think, and took a step forward. He raised his sword with both hands and used all his strength to slash at the monster. The first slash hit the monster's chest, and it was caught off guard and forced to take a step back. The second slash followed the first, but the gargoyle reacted and spread its wings to surround him. The long sword drew a bright line of sparks on the steel-like wings. After using all his strength, Brando could only feel that the wounds on his body were about to burst open. However, he was not discouraged. The previous attack was to force the gargoyle into a defensive state. This was an opportunity, and Brando wanted to use this opportunity to go around the monster. But the gargoyle screamed and flapped its wings, and the power of 4OZ was enough to topple mountains and overturn seas. Brando lost his grip on the long sword, and the Roman sword flew out of his hand and hit the wall of the tomb, creating a few sparks, and fell to the other end of the corridor. He was thrown to the other side of the wall. He groaned, and his body felt like it was about to fall apart. The only thing that kept him awake was his mind. Brando suddenly realized that because of the monster's unexpected action, he was very close to Gerald's tomb. This thought was like a tranquilizer, and it cleared his mind, allowing him to know what he should do. He shouted and regained his strength. Enduring the intense pain that felt like he was going to be torn apart, he struggled to get up and ran in that direction. Gargoyles were mechanical creatures, usually entomb guards, so there must be something that could command them. That was right, the gargoyle talisman its chance, its. The light in front of him was getting brighter, and the gentle white light was so warm that it could seep into his soul and calm him down. But Brando's heart was still pounding, he only had a few seconds to live, and success or failure depended on this one move. But he immediately heard the sound of a heavy object behind him. The young man's heart tightened, and his battle experience urged him to jump forward, but he was still a second too late. Brando felt something tighten around his ankle while he was still in the air. The icy gargoyle actually stretched out its long claws and grabbed onto his foot, dragging him back to the ground. Brando fell heavily to the ground and coughed out a mouthful of blood. It was not that he had not experienced a worse situation than this in the game. But he had never been as anxious as he was now. Failure meant death. What should he do? The unyielding talent still had 10 seconds left. Should he take a gamble? This thought was like a ray of light that shone into his heart. He gritted his teeth and turned over. As if he was blessed with good fortune, he raised his right hand and aimed at the gargoyle with the ring on his index finger. 8 seconds. There was a trace of fear in the gargoyle's green eyes. It screamed and flew back, subconsciously releasing its claws from Brando. The wizard craftsmen of Buga were undoubtedly the smartest group of people in the world. The war creatures they created were powerful and cunning, but Brando took advantage of this at this moment. Wisdom was like a double-edged sword, or an apple hanging on a tree that tempted people to fall. But once a creature had wisdom, it would know how to think, fear, and protect itself. Just like now. Brando gasped for breath, he closed his eyes, and he could not help but tremble. But our protagonist knew that he could not relax, he did not have much time left. 6 seconds. The young man almost used his willpower to support himself to turn over again. He crawled towards the tomb that was filled with a sacred atmosphere, and the first thing he saw was the sword on the sarcophagus, Thorn of Light. But he did not care about this now, he was looking for something else. 3 seconds. His eyes locked on the left side of the tomb, the second floor, the second compartment. He tore open the cobwebs and put his hand inside. A group of worms crawled out, and he took out the bottle. It was a custom-made bottle number 12 from the Holy Cathedral, with a flame symbol on it. Brando turned over and could not help but put the bottle on his chest. He took deep breaths, as if he wanted to use all his strength to feel this remaining blessing. There was still a moment left, the thumping of his heart reminded him. Brando almost trembled as he pulled out the cork of the bottle, and then he raised his head and poured the swaying liquid into his mouth. At first, a bitter taste filled his taste buds, but the taste was so pure that our protagonist could not help but praise the gods. Holy water number 7, 16 ounces. In the year of the new moon flower, the white-robed priest Tamara ordered the production of this type of holy water to cope with the increasing consumption on the front line. It was a substitute for holy water number 5. It could restore 25 HP, but it was only effective for non-fatal injuries. Brando remembered that this was the most common item in the game. The holy water immediately took effect. The first thing that healed was the abrasions on his limbs, which were almost healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. Then it was the sword wound. The itchy effect lasted for a few minutes before it stopped. Brendel tried to take a deep breath, and immediately found that the feeling of difficulty in breathing had completely disappeared. He opened his eyes and found that the gargoyle outside did not chase after him. Of course, this was not because it was afraid of the Ring of the Wind Empress. Brando guessed that it must be because the monster could not enter the tomb at all. With his experience in the game, he knew that many tombs of night had a corresponding sacred enchantment, which did not allow evil creatures to desecrate. He breathed a sigh of relief and sat up to check his injuries. The only remaining wound was the one that Brando suffered at the beginning. Because it was a fatal wound in his heart, the effect of the holy water number 7 was very limited. But it was enough. Brando stood up from the ground. He could not help but want to shout in excitement. This was the best state he had ever been in since he came to this world. There was no pain, the weakened state was gone, and he could use his body's strength as he wished. The young man could not help but let out a long sigh, his heart surging for a long time. Martha above, even in such a difficult situation, he still managed to pull through. Even he could not believe it. What kind of pride and glory was this? He clenched his fists, and it took him a lot of effort to calm himself down. Because he still remembered Freya and Irene, now was the time to carry out the next plan. Of course, before that, he turned his head and his gaze fell on the shining sword on the stone coffin. It was the Thorn of Light. Leaf-shaped swords were not common in the human world, because this was an elven sword. Brando looked up along the silver-braided gauntlet, and indeed saw 2 rows of fine elven words on the sword. The sword is born from the light, and all enemies are terrified. He had never seen this sword before, but he knew its name. Legend had it that the Thorn of Light was a level 19 ancient longsword. Not only was it extremely sharp, but it could also increase the strength, willpower, and vitality of the wielder by 1 ounce. What did it mean to increase strength and vitality by 1 ounce at a lower level? This meant that if Brando used it, his strength and vitality would be doubled. The most important thing was that someone had seen the Thorn of Light in the game, and it had the ability to detect the undead that many people dreamed of. As long as an undead approached the sword, it would emit a bright light, which was the origin of its name. Brando looked at the sword and sighed. In the game, the elves made a total of 17 similar swords, but most of them were destroyed by the Dark Lords of Madara at the end of the First Era. In the end, there were only 3 left. This was one of them. He reached out and grabbed the hilt, and a surge of energy immediately entered his body. He felt that he had become stronger, and his arms were lighter. But before Brando could fully appreciate the changes, a feeling appeared in his mind. "Young man, you want to inherit my path?" "Ha!" Brando's eyebrows twitched, and he immediately realized what it was. The certificate of profession. This was the certificate of profession. The certificate of profession was not rare in the game, but it was what he needed the most at the moment. But Brando did not expect that the certificate of profession provided by the Knight of the Holy Church, Gerald, was a mercenary and not a Knight of the Church. What was going on? Discovered the certificate of profession mercenary. Requires 2 EXP to upgrade to level 1. Do you wish to take this job? Of course, even if he was not a knight, a mercenary was not bad either. At least it was better than being a militia, right? Take this job, a line of words lit up in his vision. Mercenary, charge, charge, a surprise attack on the enemy. Speed increased by 10 times. Cooldown, 1 minute. Cannot be used while in a weakened state. Brando could recite the effect of this skill even with his eyes closed. He was too familiar with it, because this was the initial skill of the warrior class. Is this fate? Brando clenched his fist. He looked around the tomb. He was not interested in the belongings of the deceased. What he wanted was the holy water used to ward off evil spirits. This thing was too precious, it could save a life at a critical moment. But in the end, the young man's gaze stopped on a small ebony gargoyle. It was a statue. It was this thing. Brando was shocked. This was the gargoyle talisman, the key to controlling the gargoyle. He immediately picked up the talisman. If he could control a gargoyle, then it would be a pleasant surprise. It could even be the biggest reward of this trip. But at this time, the tomb shook violently, and the ceiling was filled with mud and sand. Brando turned his head and heard an explosion from a distance. It was from the direction of the ranch. He was shocked. Did something happen to Freya and Irene? This was the only possibility that Brando could think of. He couldn't wait to grab 2 bottles of less effective holy water number 9. He wrapped them in his blood-stained clothes and rushed out of the tomb. However, in his haste, he did not notice that a piece of paper had fallen from the holy water that he had casually swept away. Brando ran into the gargoyle as soon as he rushed out. But this time, he had the gargoyle talisman, so the monster didn't dare to act rashly. It could only stand aside obediently as a statue. It was a pity that the talisman required a password to activate, otherwise he could have brought the gargoyle and killed his way out. Even though there were 2 necromancers in the Green Village, there was no place for them in front of a level 23 gargoyle. There was no other reason. The mechanical gargoyle couldn't be affected by the decay spell. The young man quickly ran out of the tomb, but before he could take a breath, a strong wind suddenly came from the darkness. P.S. Thank you for your support. It's finally on the front page. Here's the second update at 6 p.m. Since I'm so awesome, do you dare to support me more? Fate parted before my eyes into 2 straight lines that were not related to each other. One of them led to the burning palaces and cities. The kingdom was overturned, the land bore the burden of suffering. The living beings suffered in the fire, and they would never see the light of day again. The other leads to the top of the ancient kings. God personally crowns me in the clouds. I wear the laurel crown and bathe in the mountains. My eyes see through the fog of history. My night expands my territory for me. My sword cuts through the thorns and leads my people to victory. I take this scepter and hold the power of the world in my hands. I look down on all living things and change the course of history. I am Brando, the King of Wound. This is my legend. Which one do you prefer, this one or the current one? Chapter 27. Brando tilted his head and let the skeleton pass by him. He had almost forgotten about the skeleton in the meditation room, but he was no longer the same person as before. He placed his hand on the hilt of the sword. The sword flashed, and a layer of white light appeared on the thorn of light. Half of the skeleton's body flew into the air. Brando looked at the skeleton that was gradually turning into ashes. The thorn of light was indeed a sword that was born in light, it even had a purifying effect. A golden light shot into his chest. A weapon with a purifying effect would deal double the damage to the undead. No wonder he felt no resistance when his sword cut through the skeleton, it was like a hot knife cutting through butter. A divine weapon. Brando only had one evaluation of the sword. Even if it was not a divine weapon, it was not far from it in this environment. But he was more worried about Freya and Irene's safety. He immediately pushed away the crumbling skeleton and ran out. His 2-ounce agility was fully utilized at this moment, and he was not inferior to the world's top athletes in his previous world. In fact, he might even surpass them in terms of balanced explosive power. With the support of the Thorn of Light and the Ring of the Wind Empress, his strength, vitality, and agility all broke through too. If Brando appeared on Earth now, there would only be one explanation in the eyes of a normal person, Superman, except for the fact that he could not fly. Brendel went back the way he came from, and the twisting path in the darkness was no longer an obstacle to him. He leaped out from the collapsed walls of the temple, and the strong breath of life on his body immediately attracted the attention of the wandering undead nearby. 2 skeletons on his left and right made cracking sounds as they wobbled towards him. But what awaited them were 2 silver swords. Brando kept the 2 EXP in his inventory and immediately looked towards the direction of the farm. His pupils immediately shrank. There was an obvious fire in that direction, and the fire almost dyed half the night sky red. In his vision, hundreds of skeletons were slowly surrounding that direction. He knew that these low-level undead would not act on their own. This meant that the lich behind them had noticed something. Freya, Irene. Brando's heart sank, but just as he was about to rush over, he heard a sharp and sinister voice behind him. "There's a human over there, kill him." Brando turned his head and discovered a lich commanding 6 skeleton soldiers in a row to slowly approach him from one end of the street. The lich raised the bone staff in his hand. But Brendel was faster than it. He activated his charge skill and closed in on it like a blur. "Stop him." The necromancer was startled and screamed hysterically. The skeleton soldier at the front raised its sword, but it was met with the cold face of the young man. A sentence suddenly flashed through Brando's mind. That sentence was so clear that it seemed to contain all the feelings of the original owner of this body. "Bastards of Madara, it's your turn to suffer." He did not care about techniques and directly used the elven sword to exchange blows. A metallic sound pierced through the eardrums. The steel sword in the skeleton soldier's hand bent backwards under the immense force and then broke with a clang. Brando charged forward. The skeleton soldier was split into 4 parts along with the sword. At this moment, there was no longer any obstruction between him and the lich. The repulsive undead opened its leaky lower jaw sluggishly. There was only astonishment on its withered face. "This sword is for Brando." He opened his mouth and the sword pierced through the lich's left rib and came out from the 3rd rib on its back. The Thorn of Light was glowing. Brando stared at the lich's burning green eyes and said. He swung the sword from front to back. The soul fire in the lich's eyes flickered for a moment and then dimmed. With a clang, the arm that was holding the bone staff flew far away and was burned to ashes by the purifying fire. 3 golden lights rose from the night sky and merged into the young man's chest. He turned around and saw 2 skeleton soldiers flanking him from the left and right. Brando raised his sword and the first skeleton's arm immediately flew up. With another twist of the sword, the skeleton's head rolled down. He took advantage of the situation and pushed the rib that had already been purified towards its companion. The skeleton soldier immediately raised its sword to block the attack, but before it could raise its sword, a bright flash of a sword had already sliced it in half. Whoosh! Madara's lowest-ranked undead soldier's metal rings scattered all over the ground like a flower petals from the heavens. 2 spots of golden light flashed and disappeared. Brando immediately called out to his status panel. Rows of ghostly data immediately appeared in his vision. He selected one of them and said in his heart, Profession and EXP. A series of dark green data appeared, XP, 11, Commoner level 1, Militia level 2, 6 out of 10, Mercenary level 1, 0 out of 10. He used his sword to block the skeleton soldier's attack and said in his heart, 11 EXP, level up Mercenary. The data immediately changed, XP, 0, Commoner level 1, Militia level 2, 6/10, mercenary level 2, 1 out of 130. Brando raised his sword and used his strength to push the skeleton soldier back. Then he glanced at his own attributes. Strength and constitution had increased by 0.2 ounces, dexterity and wisdom had also increased by 0.1 ounce. But the key point was still the 25 EXP. This point alone was enough to make the militia class lose its value. He took a deep breath. Well, now he had 2.3 ounce strength, 2.1 ounce dexterity, 2.2 ounce physique, 8.0 ounces absolute strength. It had exceeded the player's initial attributes and had begun to move towards level 1 strength. At this moment, Brando's heart suddenly calmed down. He looked at the 3 skeleton soldiers in front of him as if he was looking at air. Yes, he was back. Finally, 10 minutes was enough for the smoke to dissipate. At the end of the street, the sound of horse hooves came from afar. 2 horses. On the long street, 2 young riders rode side by side. They stopped their horses and looked around. They were surprised to see the remains of skeletons on the ground. They were speechless for a moment. Zeta, did you see that? There's only one person. Is it Fortress Reden's guards? There's a necromancer over there. Martha is on top. Zeta, can you fight against 4 of them? No, I can't. This is an old soldier. The skinny young man on the horse looked around silently. A look of disbelief gradually appeared on his face. Ryan, there are 6 skeleton soldiers here. The surroundings became quiet. 7. We have to tell this to the vice captain. What do you think this is? A regular soldier? Or a traveling knight? The young man called Ryan turned around and stared at his companion. I can't guess, Ryan, but I agree with your opinion. When Brando arrived at the ranch, it was already in a sea of fire. The burning buildings formed a bright background. Not far away, there were occasional sounds of buildings collapsing. However, he did not see the undead army chasing after Freya and Irene as he expected. On the contrary, he saw many newly awakened skeletons fleeing in panic in the raging sea of fire. The bright flames were the natural enemy of these low-level undead. Their weak soul fire trembled under the strong light and was almost purified into ashes. This was not blue fire. In the game, Madara's army only used cold soul fire. Brando immediately realized that this fire was not set by the undead. Could it be Freya and Irene? He shook his head. He did not think that the 2 of them would be so decisive. He turned his head sharply in one direction and saw a group of skeleton soldiers chasing in a certain direction. He squinted his eyes and saw a layer of flickering black light on the skeletons. Was there a necromancer nearby? Brando immediately unsheathed his sword and the thorn of light glowed with a dim light. As he walked in that direction, a few reckless low-level skeletons brushed past him. Soon, our hero gained 7 experience points again. But before the young man could get close, a loud noise suddenly came from the corner in front of him. Countless bone fragments and metal rings scattered in all directions, accompanied by 2 or 3 skeletons that were thrown high into the air and fell into the sea of fire not far away. Brando was shocked. This was level 1 strength, 3 ounces 20 ounces. He immediately realized. Who was behind the sea of fire? Humans. The regular army of Fortress Reden. But they did not appear here in the game. He instinctively got into a defensive position. When he looked up, he saw a group of knights rushing out from the sea of fire. It was like a flood, instantly sweeping out from the sea of fire. The leader of the riders immediately turned to him and raised his sword. The riders behind him pulled their reins at the same time. The whole group stopped in unison. Who are you? The knight coldly asked. It sounded like a young man. But the other party was immediately startled. Brando could not see the other party's expression because of the light, but he could feel that the person knew him. No, it was more accurate to say that he knew the original Brando. Then he heard the whispers of the knights behind him. I bet, it's a militia. I know him. But you guessed right, it's really just a militia. Brando frowned slightly. When his eyes gradually adjusted to the strong light, he finally saw the attire of these people. Thick blue coat, dragon scale breastplate, shining white iron helmet and a knight's sword. There was also a silver badge with a black pine leaf insignia. Butchie's guards. Brando, why are you here? The leader of the knights asked in a condescending tone. I have the same question. Brando recalled this person's name from his memory, Breton, who was also a citizen of Bragg's City like him. Because of his outstanding performance in the militia training, he was selected to join the guards and was sent to Butchie's border for training. Of course, this was only on the surface. Because no matter how outstanding Breton was, he would not be able to surpass Brando, who was the #1 swordsman in the same batch. But since the father of a local officer spoke up, the rest of the story naturally became smoother. He knew about the grudges between the two, but it was not grudges. At most, they looked down on each other. Sure enough, Breton immediately opened his mouth. Militia, as the vice captain of the Butchie Guards, I want you to report to me immediately. Why are you here? The group of knights immediately snickered. They knew that Breton was only trying to find trouble for his fellow countrymen. As for the report, it was just an excuse. Brando raised his head. Author's note, as promised, I'll do my best. Thanks to D-Blade, Blood Cicada, Lionhead, SJWGYYB0, Green Knight Lions, Langarisa, Untek, Juan 12387, Pirate Vanguard, Bookfriend 0809030914333371 Marshall Saint Dragon, Moo Ruffing, Slothful Side, Meow Meow, Necromancer Apprentice for their generous rewards. Some of them are old friends that have supported me since Canaan, and some are new friends that I've met in Amber. I'd like to thank you for your support. Chapter 28. The raging flames continued to burn, and the golden-red flames formed a gradually darkening line at the edge of each person's face. Brando raised his head and looked at the young vice-captain seriously. He saw the same serious expression on the other party's face. The other party pursed his lips and stared at him without saying a word, as if he wanted to use a stern gaze to force him to submit. But no matter if it was Sophie or Brando, neither of them would fall for this trick. I am a militia from Anquise. May I ask Captain Breton, since when did Butchie's guards have the authority to issue orders to their allies from other jurisdictions? May I ask where is your order of appointment, my lord? The moment he opened his mouth, the knight behind Breton was stunned. Brando had fought for Erewhon for 21 years in the game, so he was much more familiar with this country's laws and regulations than these brats. The young vice-captain thought for a moment, and replied stubbornly, special times require special treatment. Brando knew that the other party could not bring himself to admit defeat, but he did not want to bicker with them. If not for Breton taking the initiative to cause trouble, he would have been too lazy to care about this childish dispute. I am looking for Freya and Irene, have you seen them? He raised his head and asked. This was the question that Brando was most concerned about. The surrounding fire seemed to be lit by the young guards, but he could not help but maliciously think that Erewhon's future goddess of war would not be burned to death like this, right? Breton, you have committed a great sin. Of course, this was just a thought. But Breton felt that Brendel's nonchalant tone was arrogant, but he really could not think of anything to be proud of from a person who had fallen from grace, and who was not doing well in the world. He suppressed the disgust in his heart, and opened his mouth. Freya. The 3rd Militia Squadron. What is she doing with you? Brando could tell that this guy had a good impression of Freya, but his unfriendly tone made him feel uncomfortable. As the saying goes, even a clay bodhisattva has a temper. Captain Breton, it is my freedom to choose who I want to be with. As for what I'm doing here, I'm afraid I'm the same as you. Don't think I don't know what kind of situation you're in right now, he couldn't help but retort. Brat, what kind of attitude is this? A young man behind Breton shouted angrily, you're just a mere militia. The one in front of you is an officer of the garrison. Why aren't you straightening your posture? Brando was startled by the scolding, but he raised his head and looked at the other party carefully. As if following his gaze, the row of riders in front of him turned solemn, as if they were trying to intimidate him. He looked at the 15 young men who stood upright on their horses like knives. They were uniformly dressed in dark blue military uniforms. Their armor was neat and shiny, showing the demeanor of an elite force. These youths have the right to be arrogant. They are the best youths from the villages and towns in the Grimoires region. After going through strict training and selection, the rest of them are at least close to first-tier strength. According to the rules of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, a person with an average strength between 3 ounces and 20 ounces could be considered as having level 1 strength. This level 1 strength system included all the white-ranked swordsmen, sorcerer apprentices, and elementalists, beginner elementalists, in the entire continent, as well as the knight squires of the Holy Church and the low-ranked clergy. The Holy Cathedral of Fire used the amber stone to test the purity of each person's strength. Brando had seen this kind of tool in the game before, but it was used by NPCs in that game. The players had direct data, so there was no need to test it. He had read some information in the game before. He knew that in the whole of Wond, the number of people who had level 1 strength exceeded 60% of the total population. This was because the average lifespan here was more than 160 years. However, if the range was narrowed down to the age group of 17 to 19 years old, the same proportion would drop to 20% or even lower. In Erewhon, apart from the church, sorcerer academies, and knight squads, most of the 20% of people served in the garrison. Which was why he was looking at these people now. Indeed, in the face of a mixed group of militia, these young people could be arrogant. However, militia was militia, and Brando was Brando. As a person who grew up in a free world, he was indeed an anomaly in this world, and he would never think of being inferior to others. This was the deep-rooted understanding of modern people: God is the greatest, and I am the second. Thus, he coldly stared at this guy, secretly estimating his strength. Although his opponents were not ordinary, Brando believed that he was not inferior to them in terms of stats after obtaining the Thorn of Light and the Ring of the Wind Empress. Moreover, he also had the level 130 Veteran Warriors experience cheat, so he could guarantee that these guys would be defeated one after another. Of course, they could swarm him, but Brando guessed that Breton could not afford to lose face. However, what surprised him was that the young vice captain actually raised his hand to stop his team members, and asked with a heavy expression, "How do you know what we are here for?" "What else do you know?" "Who told you?" Brando thought to himself, "Of course I know. Why would Butchie's guards appear here, and what is their goal?" The young man did not know every detail, but as long as he thought about the general direction of history, he would be able to guess most of it. He knew that they were not here to retaliate, but there had to be a motive, right? As long as he sorted out his thoughts and thought about how Butchie's guards were trying to break through Fortress Reden's encirclement, wouldn't everything make sense? This was the same as the game's history. In the game, it should be on this day that Madara's undead army completed their blockade of the Belder Forest. This afternoon or early afternoon, Butchie's guards and the escaping villagers were attacked by the undead army. That was the closest they were to Fortress Reden in history. They almost succeeded, but Cabia's skeleton army arrived and destroyed all their efforts. At this moment, Fortress Reden did not even realize that there was an invasion coming from the east. But this was not a coincidence, and it was not because luck was not on Butchie's side. It was because they were facing the terrifying and efficient left wing of Insursta's dragon army from the First War of the Black Rose. No matter how much they brought along their families, the weak, women, and children, the Butchie guards could not match the speed of this famous undead army. Furthermore, they were being chased down by Rothko's necromancer army. These 2 points made their failure a tragedy. Brando looked at the young riders, their faces were covered in dust, and he guessed that this was the first time Martin was defeated. This veteran of the November War needed food and medicine to pacify the people so that he could break through the encirclement again. But the other side would not expect him to suffer a second and third failure so quickly. Martin still had a day and a half before One-Eyed Tarkus's main army arrived, and the tragedy would repeat itself. Perhaps he would be lucky enough to escape with his life, but he would lose all the glory of being a soldier. Brando shook his head and did not have the mood to argue anymore. But he was not a person who would repay evil with good, and he replied with disdain, "Do you still need to ask? You came here with such fanfare, isn't it written all over your face?" Youth, the young man behind Breton's back had veins popping out on his forehead. If not for Breton stopping him, he would have pulled out his sword and dueled with Brando. "You guessed right, but since you are not willing to take up the responsibility of a militia, please step aside." The young captain opened his mouth. "Please do not block our path." Wait, Brando could not help but feel a little angry. Is this guy trying to provoke me? He stood in the middle of the road and asked in a low voice, "Are the villagers with you?" "It has nothing to do with you." "How many people are injured?" Brando asked. Breton's face stiffened. "It has nothing to do with you." "Of course it has something to do with me. Among them are my friend's relatives, Freya, Petit Finus, Irene, and Mackie. Their families are among them. Freya and the others are fighting to protect Butchie, but what are you fighting for?" Brando asked. "Listen carefully, I am not arguing with you, I just want to know an answer." His powerful words silenced all the young guards, and the whispers that they had been whispering to each other all this time disappeared. "Step aside, Brando," Breton said with a dark face. Brando's heart sank, and a bad premonition arose. He shook his head. "Take me to see Captain Martin, I will look for Freya and the others. I will lead you out of this predicament, but before that, you have to tell me, did something happen to the family of someone in the third squad?" Breton's face sank, and it was as dark as a storm cloud. "You?" The young captain almost squeezed out a few words from between his teeth. After he finished speaking, he turned around and waved to his team members, indicating for them to move in another direction. He did not want to say anything more to Brando, and he even regretted what he said before. Whenever he thought of the battle in the afternoon, he could not help but feel that it was the biggest nightmare of his life. He even suspected that this nightmare would haunt him for the rest of his life. Brando stood at the side, watching the group of night leave silently. Various guesses flashed through his mind, but they all turned into one possibility. He could not help but shout, "Breton!" The young vice-captain stopped on his horse. "Is it Freya?" Breton's body stiffened, but he hesitated for a moment and nodded. "What happened?" "When you find Freya, help me pass on a message to her." "What?" Breton sighed. "If you find her, apologize to her on my behalf. Tell her that Aunt and Uncle Sil were unfortunate in the battle this afternoon." Just as he was about to say this, he suddenly heard a soft clang behind him. Everyone was startled. The knight turned around and saw Freya with a pale face, her sword falling to the ground. She had a look of disbelief on her face. The young man called Irene followed behind the future Valkyrie with a helpless look on his face. "Freya." Brendel was taken aback. He had already guessed what Breton was going to say with his mouth full of nonsense. How was that possible, and wouldn't, Freya suddenly started sobbing. Her pale face was filled with tears. Everyone had a weak spot in their heart. When Brendel saw the strong Freya squatting down and crying pitifully like an injured animal, he felt as though the softest part of his heart was struck. His throat felt dry, and he wanted to say something to comfort her, but he could not find the words to do so. He looked at her silently, but suddenly realized something. Could it be that after going through the baptism of such a cruel war, that simple, and kind-hearted country girl finally walked the path of becoming a Valkyrie? Then history was going back on track. Note, regarding professions and experience, in the Amber Sword, the characters can take up any profession they want, just like in the real world. He can be a cook today, a tailor tomorrow, a warrior, or even a scout. But a person's time is limited. His experience in battles, adventures, and production is always limited. If a person can't focus on one profession, every time he takes up another profession, he will receive an experience penalty due to distraction. From the first profession, excluding commoners, onwards, the experience requirement for each profession will be doubled. Also, if there is no special explanation, the setting of the Wound World and the Amber Sword game are always the same. P.S. Strange, I can't see the reward list, and the front desk doesn't show it fully. I can only thank everyone who supported me by donating. I feel like my collection is quite small. Readers, please help me promote more. Thank you. Next is my daily life. Please support me and let the Amber Sword continue to rise in the new books list. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.